This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I still get goosebumps talking about this, but I need to get it off my chest. This happened about 2 years ago when I was working at Henderson's Feed and Supply on the outskirts of Little Rock. The job wasn't much, stocking feed bags, inventory, helping farmers load their trucks, but it paid decent for our area, and the late shift, 4 p.m. to 2 a.m., suited me fine since I've always been a night owl. The drive home was usually peaceful, just me, my old Ford F-150, and miles of empty Arkansas back roads. I actually looked forward to those drives, windows down, cool night air, and usually some classic Waylon Jennings or Johnny Cash keeping me company on the radio. County Road 12 was the final stretch before home, a narrow 2-lane road with no streetlights, thick forest on both sides, and the occasional farm or pasture breaking up the tree line. That night started like any other. I clocked out at 2:15 a.m., grabbed a coffee from the gas station at the highway junction, and turned onto the familiar route home. It was early March, still cold enough for a jacket, but warm enough to have the windows cracked. The moon was barely visible through patchy clouds, casting everything in shadows. I was about halfway down County Road 12, passing Miller's cow pasture on my right, when I first heard it. At first I thought it was interference on the radio. You know how sometimes static can sound almost like a voice? I reached to adjust the dial, but the sound persisted. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from my speakers at all. It was coming from outside my truck. I slowed down and lowered my window completely. The sound was unmistakable now, a woman crying. Not screaming or wailing, but that kind of broken, exhausted sobbing that comes after you've been crying for hours. My first thought was that someone might be hurt or stranded. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, leaving my headlights on and the engine running. My clock read 3:22 a.m. The crying continued, seemingly coming from the roadside ditch or the trees just beyond it. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, then the small mag light I keep in my glove box for backup. Looking back, I can't explain why I got out of that truck. Everything in me was screaming that this was wrong, that normal people don't cry alone on rural roads at 3 a.m., but I've always had this stupid hero complex. What if someone really needed help? "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding ridiculously small in the darkness. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The crying stopped instantly. For maybe 5 seconds, there was complete silence. Then it started again, but now it was coming from about 50 feet further down the road. That should have been my first warning, but instead of getting back in my truck, I followed the sound. I walked past the edge of Miller's pasture where the barbed wire fence runs alongside the road and cedar trees grow thick. The crying stayed ahead of me, never getting closer, no matter how far I walked. After following for what must have been 200 yards, I suddenly realized something that made my blood run cold. All the background noise of the countryside had stopped. No crickets, no frogs, no cicadas, nothing. It was like someone had hit mute on the entire world, leaving only that soft, broken crying. I stopped walking and shone my flashlight into the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're okay." That's when I heard it. A woman's voice, barely above a whisper, speaking Spanish. "Mis niñas, mi esposo." I took 4 years of Spanish in high school, enough to recognize what she said. My daughters, my husband. Every hair on my body stood up at once. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice sounded like it was coming from right in front of me, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I took an involuntary step backward and fumbled in my pocket for my cigarette lighter, thinking irrationally that I needed something, anything, to see better. The lighter slipped from my fingers and hit the gravel road with a small clink. That tiny sound broke whatever trance I was in. I turned and ran back to my truck, heart hammering against my ribs. I don't think my feet touched the ground once. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out, tires spinning on loose gravel, I looked in my rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just darkness and the fading red of my taillights. I didn't tell anyone what happened at first. Who would believe me? But about a week later, I was having beers with my buddy Miguel, who'd moved here from Oaxaca when he was a teenager. I casually mentioned hearing a woman crying on County Road 12, trying to play it off like I was just curious if he'd heard any similar stories. Before I could even finish my question, Miguel's face went pale. He put down his beer and said, "La Llorona." When I asked what that meant, he explained it was a legend throughout Mexico and parts of the American Southwest. The ghost of a woman who drowned her children and now wanders near water crying for them. I laughed it off, told him County Road 12 doesn't have any rivers or lakes nearby. He shrugged and said sometimes La Llorona doesn't cry for herself. Sometimes she warns travelers of danger. That's when my laughter died in my throat. 3 nights later, I was driving home the same route. It had been raining earlier, and the roads were still wet. As I approached that exact same stretch of County Road 12, my truck hit a slick patch. Before I could react, I was hydroplaning, spinning out of control. In that moment of terror, I saw headlights coming from the opposite direction, a semi-truck hauling livestock. My truck spun directly into its path. There was no way the driver could stop in time on the wet road, but somehow he managed to swerve just enough. The semi missed my driver's side door by inches, clipping my back bumper instead. The impact sent my truck into the ditch, but I walked away with just bruises and a dislocated shoulder. The truck driver later told the police he'd swerved because he thought he saw something in the road, a woman in white standing next to my truck. There was no woman, of course, just me. I haven't heard the crying since that night. It's like whatever it was, ghost, spirit, hallucination, whatever, accomplished what it needed to. But I still think about it every time I drive that stretch of road. I keep my windows up now. I don't stop for anything. And I find myself whispering thank you whenever I pass that spot, just in case. I've researched La Llorona extensively since then. Most stories paint her as malevolent, a spirit who lures people to their deaths. But Miguel insists there are variations of the legend where she protects travelers, especially those who remind her of her lost family. I don't know why a Mexican ghost would be haunting backroads in Arkansas, or why she would choose to warn me specifically. The rational part of me wants to believe it was just an animal, or my imagination playing tricks after a long shift. Maybe I dozed off at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe the crying was just the wind through the trees, and my mind filled in the rest. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And sometimes when I'm driving home late, with the radio turned low, I catch myself listening for that crying again. Half afraid I'll hear it, half afraid I won't. The truck driver who nearly hit me quit his job the next day. Said he couldn't shake the image of that woman in white. When I tried to thank him for saving my life, he just shook his head and said, "Wasn't me that saved you, son. I don't drive County Road 12 at night anymore if I can help it. And when I do, I keep my eyes straight ahead, my windows up and my radio off. Because some things are better left alone. Some voices shouldn't be answered, and some roads are just meant to be traveled through, not stopped on, especially after dark, especially when you think you hear crying." Story 2. I never believed in ghosts or supernatural stuff. I was always the rational one in my friend group, the guy who'd laugh off scary stories and find the logical explanation. That changed 6 months ago when I inherited my grandmother's old farmhouse in southern Ohio. The property is pretty isolated, about 15 acres total with the main house, an old foundation where the barn used to be, and a lot of overgrown fields. My grandma had been living with my parents for years before she passed, so the place had been sitting empty. I was between jobs and needed a fresh start, so moving into a mortgage-free house seemed like the perfect solution. I noticed it the moment I walked through the door with my first load of boxes. The air felt wrong. It's hard to describe if you haven't experienced it. You know that feeling when you walk into a room right after people have had a massive fight, that lingering tension that makes your skin prickle. That's what it felt like, except nobody had been in the house for years. I chalked it up to dust and mustiness and focused on cleaning. My dog Cooper seemed fine at first, exploring every corner, marking his new territory. He's a lab mix, super chill normally. I got the utilities turned on, scrubbed everything down, and spent that first week painting and fixing minor issues. During the day, things were fine, but the nights, that's when it started. The dreams came first, not your typical nightmares where you're falling or being chased. These were different, like someone was deliberately placing images in my head. I'd dream I was standing in the field behind the house at night, and something was emerging from the ground where the old barn foundation sits. Something big and wrong. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, with this overwhelming certainty that I wasn't supposed to see whatever was trying to show itself. After about 2 weeks, I started feeling watched during the day. I'd be doing something normal, making coffee, reading, working on my laptop, and suddenly feel eyes on me. I'd turn around expecting to see Cooper, but he'd be in another room. This happened so often I started getting used to it, which is pretty messed up looking back. Cooper started acting weird too. He'd stand at the foot of the stairs and growl at nothing. Not a playful growl, but deep in his chest, hackles raised. He'd follow something with his eyes across the living room, something I couldn't see. I've had that dog for 7 years and never seen him behave like that. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, about a month after I moved in. I remember it was raining, one of those steady, all-day drizzles that makes everything feel damp and cold. I'd gone to bed around 11 after binge-watching some show on Netflix. Cooper was sleeping on the floor beside my bed as usual. I woke up suddenly, that jarring kind of awakening where you go from deep sleep to completely alert in a split second. The bedside clock read 3:22. The room was freezing cold despite it being May. Cooper wasn't on his bed. Instead, he was pressed against the far wall, as far from my bed as possible, making this weird whimpering sound I'd never heard before. And I knew with absolute certainty that something was standing beside my bed. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I felt it. It was like my brain was receiving information that my eyes weren't processing. In my mind, I could perceive this shape. It was tar black, darker than the darkness in my room, roughly human-sized but wrong in its proportions. It had limbs that seemed too long, too jointed, and its head was like a sheep's but twisted, malformed, with eyes set at unnatural angles. It wasn't actually visible, but somehow I could sense exactly what it looked like, as if it was projecting its image directly into my thoughts. The worst part, I could feel that it wanted me to look directly at it. It wanted acknowledgement, recognition. I kept my eyes firmly closed, pretending to still be asleep, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the presence receded. The temperature in the room gradually returned to normal. Cooper eventually crawled back to his bed, though he remained alert until morning. I told myself it was sleep paralysis, a particularly vivid nightmare, my mind playing tricks in a new, unfamiliar house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The following week, things escalated. I was shaving in the bathroom mirror when I felt that same watching presence. The mirror fogged up despite the fan being on, and when I wiped it clear for just a split second, I thought I saw something reflected behind me. That same wrongly shaped silhouette. I spun around, but nothing was there. Cut myself pretty bad with the razor in the process. Then there was the coffee mug incident. I was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through job listings on my laptop. My coffee mug was about a foot away from my right hand. I wasn't looking directly at it, but it was in my peripheral vision. Suddenly, it slid about 6 inches toward me with an audible thunk. Not like it was on a wet spot and slowly drifted. It moved in one quick, deliberate motion like someone had pushed it. I sat there frozen, staring at the mug. trying to come up with some explanation. The table wasn't uneven. There wasn't an earthquake. Cooper was outside at the time. I was completely alone in the house, yet something had just moved an object right in front of me. That night, around 2 in the morning, the smoke alarm went off. It blared for about 30 seconds, then stopped on its own. I checked the whole house. No smoke, no fire, nothing that could have triggered it. I replaced the batteries the next day. The following night, same time, it happened again. I called a local handyman who also volunteers as a firefighter. He came out, checked the entire system, found nothing wrong, and suggested it might be dust in the sensors. He cleaned everything thoroughly. That night, 2 a.m. exactly, it went off again. I started researching the history of the property. My parents didn't know much, except that the original barn had burned down sometime in the 70s before they'd even met. I went to the local library and looked through old newspaper archives, finally found a small article from 1976. The barn on my grandmother's property had indeed burned down, June 12, 1976. The fire had started around 2 in the morning. 2 unidentified men, described as drifters, who had apparently been sleeping in the barn without permission, died in the fire. The cause was never determined. The article was brief, matter of fact, with no follow-up stories that I could find. When I asked the librarian if she knew anything about the incident, her expression changed immediately. She claimed not to know details, but suggested I let sleeping dogs lie. When I pressed her, she reluctantly mentioned that there had been rumors at the time that the fire wasn't accidental, that my grandfather, who died when I was very young, had known the drifters were there and had some kind of confrontation with them earlier that day. Nothing was ever proven. That night, I dreamed I was standing where the barn used to be. In my dream, I could see it intact, not burned down. Inside, 2 men were sleeping on hay bales. A figure approached with a gas can. The figure turned, and I saw my own face, but wrong somehow. Eyes too wide, smile too broad. I woke up gasping for air. The activity increased after that. The smoke alarm went off every night at 2 a.m. exactly. Objects would move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Once, all the kitchen cabinet doors opened simultaneously while I was making dinner. Cooper refused to enter certain rooms and would stand barking at empty corners for hours. The night visits continued. Always between 3 and 4 in the morning, I would wake to that presence beside my bed. Each time, I sensed it wanted me to look at it, to acknowledge it. Each time, I refused, keeping my eyes shut tight, pretending to sleep until it went away. But each visit lasted longer than the previous one, the entity growing more insistent. I started sleeping with the lights on. It made no difference. I tried sleeping in different rooms. The presence found me. I even spent a few nights in a motel, and for those nights, nothing happened. But I couldn't afford to stay there indefinitely, and the moment I returned to the house, so did the visitations. One particularly bad night, I felt it not just standing beside the bed, but leaning over me. In my mind, I could sense its face inches from mine, those wrongly placed eyes staring, that misshapen head tilted in curiosity or hunger. I felt hot, fetid breath on my face despite seeing nothing when I finally couldn't take it anymore and opened my eyes. Cooper was going absolutely berserk, barking and growling from the hallway, unwilling to enter the bedroom. I became convinced that whatever this entity was, it was feeding off my fear. The more terrified I became, the stronger its presence felt. If I tried to ignore it or act nonchalant during the day, the activity would increase until I couldn't pretend anymore. It wanted my attention, it wanted my fear, and it was getting both. Last week, things reached a breaking point. I was in the shower when the water suddenly turned ice cold, then scalding hot within seconds. As I leaped out, the bathroom mirror shattered without anything touching it. That night, I awoke to find all the furniture in my bedroom rearranged. The bed moved to the center of the room, chairs and dresser positioned in a circle around it, like some kind of ritual setup. And Cooper was gone. I found him an hour later, huddled in the crawl space under the porch steps, shaking uncontrollably. He wouldn't come back inside the house no matter what I did. I packed a bag that morning and went to stay with my parents. I haven't been back to the farmhouse since. I've listed it for sale, but so far there's been no interest. The local real estate agent seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned the address. I still have dreams about it. In them, I'm back in the house, and something is always trying to get me to look at it directly. Something that I sense has been there since the fire, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Something that might have been human once but isn't anymore. And sometimes, in the dreams, I do look, and what I see, I wake up screaming when that happens. I've tried talking to a therapist, but how do you explain something like this without sounding completely insane? I don't know if what's in that house is the spirits of those drifters, or something that was there before them, or something that came after. All I know is that it's real, it's aware, and it's still there, waiting for me, or someone else to return. Story 3. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened at my grandparents' farm. I'm still not sure I should be writing this down, but I need to get it out of my system. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can tell me I'm not crazy. My name is Liam. I moved to my grandparents' property about 2 years ago after my grandfather passed away. Grandma was getting older and needed help maintaining the place, a small farmhouse with 15 acres in rural Wisconsin. The property had been in our family for generations. I had just finished college and was between jobs, so the timing worked out. The house itself is nothing special, just a 2-story farmhouse built sometime in the 1950s. There's an old barn about 50 yards from the house that's partially collapsed on one side. My grandfather used to store equipment there, but it had been mostly abandoned for the past decade or so. The important detail here is that my bedroom window faces that barn directly. The first few weeks were uneventful. I helped Grandma with chores, fixed things around the house, and started looking for work in the nearest town about 20 minutes away. I slept well, enjoying the quiet after 4 years of noisy college dorms. Then the sleep problems started. It began with waking up at exactly 3:15 in the morning, feeling like someone was watching me. I'd open my eyes and feel this weird pressure on my chest, like someone was sitting on me. The first couple times it happened, I brushed it off as sleep paralysis. I'd had similar episodes during particularly stressful times in college. But it kept happening, night after night, always at the same time, always with that same crushing feeling on my chest, and always with the overwhelming sense that something was staring at me through my window. My dog, Max, a black lab I'd had since high school, started acting strange too. He used to sleep at the foot of my bed, but around the time these episodes started, he began sleeping pressed up against the wall farthest from the window. Sometimes I'd wake up to find him under the bed. During the day, Max refused to go near the barn. He'd been fine exploring the property when we first arrived, but something changed. If I walked toward the barn, he'd stop about 20 feet away, hackles raised, and start whining. If I tried to coax him closer, he'd back away, tail between his legs. I should have paid more attention to his behavior. Animals know things we don't. About a month after moving in, I woke up to a dragging sound outside my window. It was like something heavy being pulled through dirt. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I froze in bed, too terrified to look. Max was awake too, pressed against the headboard, trembling. The sound continued for maybe 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. The next morning, I examined the ground outside my window. There were no marks, no signs that anything had been dragged through the dirt. I told myself it had been the wind, or maybe a raccoon rummaging around, but deep down I knew better. Things escalated from there. About a week later, I woke up to the feeling of something tugging at my ankle. Not hard, just a gentle pull, like someone trying to get my attention. I kicked out instinctively, and the sensation stopped. I lay awake until dawn, afraid to move. Max refused to come out from under the bed. I started losing sleep. Dark circles appeared under my eyes. I was irritable, unfocused. Grandma noticed and asked if everything was okay. I lied and said I was just adjusting to country life. How could I tell her what was happening? She'd think I was losing my mind. One evening, I was helping Grandma put away dishes when she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "You look tired, Liam," she said. "Are you sleeping okay in that room? Your grandfather never liked it much." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that my grandfather had always complained about that room, said it made him feel uneasy, especially at night. That's why they had moved to the bedroom on the other side of the house decades ago. When I pressed for more information, Grandma just shrugged and said, "Some places hold on to things, especially old places like that barn. Your great-grandfather used to say entities can become stuck in structures if they have unfinished business." She said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather, then she changed the subject, but her words stayed with me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. Max was especially anxious, pacing around the room instead of settling down. Around midnight, he jumped onto the bed and curled up against me, something he rarely did anymore. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up gasping for breath. The air felt thick, like it was being sucked out of the room. The pressure on my chest was worse than ever, crushing me into the mattress. I couldn't move, couldn't call out. All I could do was stare at the window, where I sensed, no, I knew, something was standing in the barn, watching me. The barn was about 50 yards away, and the collapsed portion faced my window. There was a gap in the roof that created a kind of dark recess, and I could feel something there, observing me with malevolent interest. Not just watching, but waiting, wanting. I managed to turn my head slightly toward Max. He was standing at the foot of the bed, hackles raised, staring at the window. A low, deep growl emanated from his throat, a sound I'd never heard him make before. His reaction validated what I was feeling. This wasn't sleep paralysis or an overactive imagination. Something was out there, and Max could sense it too. The growling intensified, and suddenly Max barked, a sharp, aggressive bark that broke whatever hold the thing had on me. I could breathe again, could move my limbs. I scrambled out of bed and flipped on the light switch, half expecting to see something horrific at the window. There was nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched remained. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the corner of my room with Max, a baseball bat across my lap, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but determined to investigate the barn. After making sure Grandma was settled with her morning coffee and TV show, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the barn. Max followed me part way but stopped at his usual distance, whining anxiously. I called to him, but he wouldn't budge. "It's okay, buddy," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'll be right back." The barn door hung crooked on rusted hinges. It took some effort to push it open enough to squeeze inside. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of old hay and something else, something unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, creating dusty beams that illuminated portions of the interior while leaving others in deep shadow. Farm equipment lay scattered about. Some of it probably hadn't been touched in decades. I moved carefully, mindful of rotted floorboards and rusty nails. I made my way to the section that faced my bedroom window. This was the partially collapsed area where part of the roof had caved in years ago. My grandfather had reinforced the remaining structure but never bothered to fully repair it. As I approached this section, the temperature seemed to drop. I told myself it was just because of the shade, but it felt like more than that. The air felt heavy, oppressive. My flashlight beam weakened, despite having fresh batteries. Then I found something that made my heart skip. In the dirt floor near the opening that faced my window was a small depression, like someone had been standing there regularly, wearing away the packed earth, and beside it, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a line in the dirt leading away from the house, as if something had been dragged. I knelt to examine it closer and noticed something embedded in the dirt. Using a stick, I carefully dug it out. It was an old button, bone or ivory by the look of it, attached to a scrap of what might have once been a shirt. It was so old it practically crumbled when I touched it. Something about that button made me deeply uncomfortable. I dropped it back into the depression and stood up quickly. As I did, I heard a faint sound from deeper in the barn, a scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, straining to listen. Nothing, just the normal creaks of an old structure settling. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and frightened in the dusty air. No response, but the quality of the silence changed. It became watchful, alert. I could feel eyes on me from the shadows. I backed toward the door, unwilling to turn my back on the interior of the barn. My foot hit something solid, and I nearly lost my balance. Looking down, I saw a rusty old toolbox. When I glanced back up, I swear something moved in the shadows at the far end of the barn. That was enough for me. I turned and hurried out into the sunlight, relief washing over me as I escaped the oppressive atmosphere inside. Max was waiting where I'd left him, still whining softly. When he saw me emerge, he barked once and ran back toward the house. I spent the rest of that day researching the property's history online and at the local library. I found nothing unusual, no records of accidents, murders, or unexplained disappearances. The property had been in my family since the 1920s, passed down through generations without incident. That night, I moved a dresser in front of my bedroom window and left all the lights on. I even considered sleeping on the couch downstairs, but was too embarrassed to explain why to Grandma. Max seemed calmer with the window blocked, though he still slept pressed against the wall. I must have fallen asleep around midnight because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake to the sound of the dresser scraping across the floor. It moved just an inch or two, but the noise was unmistakable. Max was on his feet, growling at the window. The room was freezing cold. I could see my breath fogging in the air. The lights were still on, but they seemed dimmer somehow, as if something was draining their energy. Then I felt it, that same tugging at my ankle. Not gentle this time, but insistent, powerful. I kicked wildly and scrambled toward the headboard, dragging the covers with me. Max was barking frantically now, lunging toward the foot of the bed and then backing away, as if conflicted between protecting me and fleeing whatever was there. The tugging stopped, but the cold remained. I huddled against the headboard, eyes fixed on the window. The dresser moved again, scraping another inch across the floor. Through the narrow gap that had opened between the dresser and the wall, I could see a patch of the night outside and the dark outline of the barn in the distance. Something was in that barn, watching my window, something that wanted me to come outside, something that was trying to drag me there. Max suddenly went silent mid-bark. He stared at the window, ears flat against his head, body trembling. Then he did something I'd never seen before. He peed on the floor in terror before bolting out of the bedroom door, which had somehow come open despite me closing it before bed. I wanted to follow him, but I couldn't move. My entire body felt paralyzed with fear. The air was getting thinner, harder to breathe. The tugging sensation returned, stronger now, pulling not just at my ankle but at something inside me, like it was trying to extract my very essence. The dresser moved again, creating a wider gap. And through that gap, I saw movement at the barn. A dark figure emerging from the collapsed section, moving with an unnatural, lurching gait toward the house, toward my window. That's when I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until Grandma came running in, until the lights flickered back to full brightness and the cold dissipated. The figure was gone. The pulling sensation stopped. Everything returned to normal so quickly that I almost doubted what I'd experienced. Almost. I moved to the guest room downstairs that very night, making up some excuse about a draft in my old room. Grandma didn't question it. Maybe she knew more than she let on. I've been sleeping downstairs ever since. The episodes have stopped, but I still won't go near the barn, and neither will Max. Sometimes, when I'm outside at dusk, I feel eyes on me from the direction of the barn, and sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I hear that dragging sound in the distance. Whatever's out there, it's still waiting, and I think it always will be. Story 4. I still can't bring myself to drive down Mill Road after dark. Not since that night 5 years ago. It's stupid, I know. I'm a grown man with a mortgage and a sensible car, but I'll drive 10 minutes out of my way just to avoid that stretch of road once the sun goes down. I grew up in Millbrook, Indiana. One of those towns so small it barely registers on most maps. We had one high school, 3 churches, and more cornfields than people. Everyone knew everyone, which meant that privacy was a luxury, and gossip was the town's primary form of entertainment. Mill Road was named for the old Grisham grain mill that sits abandoned at the end of it. The building itself has been empty since sometime in the 80s when cheaper operations pushed the local mill out of business. It's this hulking 3-story brick structure with broken windows and a rusted metal silo. During the day, it looks sad and forgotten. At night, it transforms into something straight out of a nightmare. When I was in high school, the mill was where everyone went to party. It was far enough from town that cops rarely bothered to patrol it, and the abandoned loading dock made a perfect spot to park cars out of sight. I spent countless weekend nights there drinking cheap beer and trying to impress girls with exaggerated stories about my future plans to escape Millbrook. That's where I first heard about her, the woman by Mill Road. According to local legend, back in the spring of 1976, a girl named Emily Winters was supposed to attend her senior prom with her boyfriend, Tom something or other. She lived in one of the farmhouses that dotted Mill Road back then. The story goes that Tom was running late picking her up, and Emily, worried about missing the dance, decided to walk to the main road to meet him. She was wearing her prom dress, described in most versions as pale blue or white, and was carrying her shoes to keep them clean. It was already dark, and a light rain had started to fall. When she saw headlights approaching around the bend near the mill, she thought it was Tom finally coming to get her. She stepped into the road, waving her arms to get his attention. But it wasn't Tom's car. It was a truck driven by a man passing through town. He didn't see Emily until it was too late. She died instantly, right there on Mill Road, still clutching her dance shoes. At least, that's how Mrs. Patterson, my 10th grade English teacher, told it. Other versions claim she lingered for days in the hospital before dying. Some say she was pregnant with Tom's baby when she died, and that's why her spirit can't rest. The details change depending on who's telling the story, but everyone agrees on one thing. On the anniversary of her death, Emily's ghost appears on Mill Road, still waiting for Tom to pick her up for the dance that never happened. I never believed any of it. Ghost stories were for kids and tourists, not for someone like me who prided himself on being rational. That is, until March 15th. 5 years ago. I had come home from college for spring break. My buddy Devin and I had spent the evening catching up at Rusty's, the only bar in Millbrook that didn't card too heavily. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I was staying at my parents' house on the north side of town, and Devin offered to drop me off on his way home. It had been raining earlier that night, one of those cold spring rains that makes you question whether winter is truly over. The roads were slick, and a light fog had settled over the lower areas of town. Mill Road was the quickest way to get from Rusty's to my parents' house, cutting through about 2 miles of mostly farmland before connecting to the residential streets. Man, remember when we used to hang out at the old mill? Devin asked as we turned onto Mill Road. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating maybe 30 feet of wet asphalt ahead of us. Yeah, seems like forever ago, I replied. Remember when Tyler Barrett climbed up the silo and couldn't get down? His dad had to bring a ladder from their farm. We were laughing about old memories when we reached the bend in the road near the mill. Devin was driving his dad's Ford F-150, taking it slower than usual because of the wet road. The truck's headlights swept across the pavement as we rounded the curve. That's when I saw her. 1 second the road was empty, and the next she was there, a young woman in a pale dress standing in the middle of the road. She turned toward our headlights, her face a blur of white in the darkness. Then she darted across the road, her dress billowing behind her. "Shit!" Devin shouted, slamming on the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly on the wet pavement before coming to a stop. My heart was hammering in my chest. "Did you see that?" I gasped, already knowing the answer from Devin's reaction. "What the hell was she doing out here?" Devin muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. She could have gotten herself killed. We sat there for a moment, both of us breathing hard, the windshield wipers squeaking across the glass. We should check if she's okay, I said finally. She ran off toward the ditch. Devin nodded, putting the truck in park and turning on the hazard lights. There were no other cars on the road. Mill Road was rarely busy, especially at this time of night. We both got out of the truck. The air was damp and cold, and I immediately regretted not grabbing my jacket from the back seat. Devin clicked on his phone's flashlight, pointing it toward where we'd seen the woman disappear. "Hello?" he called out. "Are you okay? We just want to make sure you're not hurt." No response. The only sound was the soft patter of drizzle on the pavement and the distant hum of the truck's engine. I walked a few paces ahead, peering into the darkness. There was a shallow drainage ditch running alongside the road, then a field that eventually led to the mill property. The grass was wet and muddy, but I couldn't see any tracks or signs that someone had run through it. "I don't see anyone," I said, turning back to Devin. He was standing still, his flashlight beam sweeping across the roadside. "This is weird, man. Where could she have gone that fast?" That's when I noticed it. A scent in the air that didn't belong, sweet and floral, like old-fashioned perfume, the kind my grandmother used to wear. It was completely out of place on this deserted road, especially in the rain. "Do you smell that?" I asked, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. Devin looked at me strangely. "Smell what?" "That perfume. It's like flowers or something." He shook his head. "I don't smell anything except wet dirt." We spent another 10 minutes searching the immediate area, calling out to the woman, but found nothing. No footprints in the mud, no sign anyone had been there at all. Back in the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. "That was the spot, wasn't it?" I asked Devin as he put the truck in drive. "What spot?" "Where that girl died, Emily, whatever her name was, the prom ghost." Devin laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, man, that's just a stupid story people tell to freak out freshmen." "But this is where it supposedly happened, right? Near the bend by the mill." "You're being ridiculous," he said, but I noticed he was driving faster than before, eager to get off Mill Road. For the rest of spring break, I tried to convince myself it had been a real person, maybe a drunk teenager or someone walking home from a late shift somewhere, but deep down I knew that didn't make sense. Where had she gone so quickly? Why were there no footprints? And that perfume? I didn't talk about it much after that night. Who wants to be known as the guy who claims he saw a ghost? But I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few weeks later, back at college, I started researching the legend. I found old newspaper archives online and spent hours scrolling through them. It took some digging, but I eventually found a small article from April 19th, 1976. It reported a fatal accident on Mill Road involving a local high school senior named Emily Winters. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs. It mentioned that Emily had been struck by a vehicle while walking along Mill Road at night. The driver, a traveling salesman, wasn't charged. The article noted that Emily had been wearing evening attire and was believed to be on her way to a school function. I felt sick reading it. The legend was real, at least the part about a girl dying on Mill Road was real. I called Devin that night and told him what I'd found. He listened quietly, then said, "Look, I didn't want to admit it that night, but I smelled it too. That perfume, like old flowers or something. I didn't want to think about what that might mean." Over the next few years, I tried to learn more about Emily Winters. It wasn't easy. Most people who would have known her had either died or moved away from Millbrook. I did find out that the anniversary of her death was actually March 15th, the exact day Devin and I had seen her. I never saw her again, though I've driven down Mill Road during daylight plenty of times since then. But I always slow down at that bend near the mill, and sometimes even with the windows up and the air conditioning on, I catch a whiff of that sweet floral perfume. The locals still tell her story, though nobody can agree on the details. Some swear they've seen her, always on rainy nights, always near that same bend in the road. Others claim it's all nonsense made up to scare kids away from the dangerous old mill. I don't try to convince anyone either way. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that there's something about that stretch of Mill Road where the air feels heavier somehow. Like somebody's still waiting there, watching headlights approach in the darkness, hoping that this time it'll be the right car coming to take her to the dance she never got to attend. Story 5. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or an afterlife. My grandmother used to say I was practical to a fault, which was her nice way of saying I was stubborn. Growing up in Cairo, Illinois, I was surrounded by her Bible verses and church potlucks, but none of it ever stuck with me. I respected her faith, but I just couldn't see things the way she did. My grandmother was the real deal when it came to religion. 92 years old and still never missed a Sunday service. She had this worn-out Bible with so many notes in the margins, you could barely read the original text. Every conversation we had somehow circled back to God or heaven. It used to drive me crazy when I was younger, but as I got older, I learned to just smile and nod. Last spring, I finally got accepted into this prestigious maritime training program I'd been trying to get into for years. It meant 3 months at sea on the Pickettton Castle, this incredible steel-hulled tall ship that's been used for training sailors since the 1970s. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but it also meant being away from home longer than I'd ever been. The week before I left, I visited Grandma at her little house on Sycamore Street. She made her famous apple pie, and we sat on her porch swing like we used to when I was a kid. She held my hand in her paper-thin skin and bony fingers and made me promise to keep an open heart to the Lord while I was at sea. I remember laughing it off, telling her the only thing I'd be open to was learning how to properly tie a bowline knot. Our ship departed from Savannah in early April. The first few weeks were incredible, learning traditional sailing techniques, navigation, meteorology. We made our way down the Atlantic coast, eventually docking in Cape Town, South Africa by early May. It happened to coincide with my grandmother's birthday, so I made sure to call her from port. The connection wasn't great, but I could hear the joy in her voice when I told her about the dolphins that had followed our ship for days, and about the stars at night, how you could see the Milky Way so clearly it looked like someone had painted it across the sky. She loved hearing about my adventures, even though I knew she worried about me being so far from home. Then, near the end of our call, she said something that made my stomach drop. "Brian, I don't think I'll be here when you get back." Her voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact, like she was telling me it might rain tomorrow. I immediately protested, telling her not to talk like that she was being dramatic. She'd been saying stuff like this for years, always preparing for meeting her maker, but she'd outlived 2 husbands and most of her friends. I figured she was just feeling lonely on her birthday. "I know what you think about all this," she continued, "but when I'm gone, I'm going to find a way to let you know I'm okay, that there's something after." I remember sighing, running my hand through my hair. I was standing in this crowded internet cafe with bad fluorescent lighting, surrounded by other sailors making calls home. I didn't want to have this conversation there, like that. "Okay, Grandma," I said, trying to humor her. "You've got yourself a deal. If you can contact me from the other side, I'll reconsider my position. But it's got to be clear, not just some coincidence I can explain away." I didn't expect her to take it so seriously. There was a pause, and then she said, with this conviction I'd never heard before, "I promise, Brian, I love you." That was the last time I spoke to her. A week later, we were sailing north along the Namibian coast. The weather had been decent for most of the voyage, but that night, a storm hit us hard. Nothing the ship couldn't handle, but rough enough that most of us were feeling pretty seasick. I'd finally managed to fall asleep in my bunk below deck, rocking with the violent motion of the ship, the creaking of the hull all around me. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It wasn't gradual, it was like someone had suddenly flipped a switch in my brain. 1 second, I was dead asleep. The next, I was wide awake, heart pounding. The ship was still pitching in the waves, but that's not what woke me. It was my grandmother's voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. "I love you." Just those 3 words, But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. It wasn't her voice as I'd heard it on the phone a week earlier. It wasn't the fragile, slightly wavering voice of a 92-year-old woman. It was her voice from when I was a child, stronger, warmer, with that slight southern lilt she'd tried to hide after moving north as a young woman. I sat bolt upright, smacking my head on the bunk above me. The cabin was dark except for the dim safety lights along the floor. My bunkmate, Josh, was still asleep, snoring softly despite the rocking of the ship. I called out a quiet, "Hello?" But of course there was no answer. Just the howling of the wind outside and the creaking of the ship's hull. I checked my watch. It was 12:47 in the morning. I couldn't go back to sleep right away. I sat there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I've never been one to remember my dreams, but this didn't feel like a dream. It felt like she had been right there beside me. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my brain playing tricks on me. I'd been thinking about her before I fell asleep, worried about her being alone, the storm, the stress of training, being thousands of miles from home. It was all just getting to me. I wrote a quick note in my sea journal about the experience and eventually fell back asleep. The storm passed by morning, and life on the ship returned to its demanding routine. Days blurred together with training exercises, maintenance duties, and navigation lessons. We were headed for St. Helena Island, and I was too busy to dwell on what had happened that night. We docked at Jamestown Harbor on St. Helena about 5 days later. It was the first chance I'd had to contact home since Cape Town. I went to the local post office, which had an international phone. I called my brother's house first, since he checked on Grandma almost daily. My sister-in-law Sarah answered. I could tell something was wrong from the moment she spoke. Her voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying not to cry. "Brian, I don't know how to tell you this," she said. "Grandma passed away in her sleep. It was on May 23rd. The neighbor found her when she didn't answer the door for their morning coffee. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. May 23rd. I asked her what time they thought it happened. The doctor said sometime in the early morning hours," Sarah said. "She looked peaceful, like she just drifted off." After hanging up, I stumbled out of the post office in a daze. I sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, watching our ship rock gently in the water, and pulled out my sea journal. I flipped back to the entry I'd written that night of the storm. May 23rd, woken suddenly at 12:47 a.m. by what sounded like Grandma's voice. Said, "I love you." Felt so real it scared me. Storm still bad. Can't sleep now. I must have read those lines 100 times. St. Helena is in the same time zone as Namibian waters where we'd been sailing. But Cairo, Illinois, is 7 hours behind. That would have made it around 5:47 in the evening on May 22nd back home. But that didn't make sense with what Sarah had said about Grandma passing in the early morning hours of May 23rd. I later found out that what actually happened was that no one had seen her since the evening of May 22nd, when her neighbor brought over dinner. She was found the morning of May 23rd, and the doctor estimated she'd been gone for several hours. The timing was close, too close to be comfortable. Whether it lined up exactly or not, the fact remains that around the time my grandmother died, I heard her voice, clear as day, thousands of miles across the ocean. The rest of the voyage passed in a blur. I went through the motions of training, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the sound of her voice, younger than I'd heard it in decades, the absolute certainty with which I'd woken up. When I finally returned home a month later, the first thing I did was visit her grave. It was a simple headstone in the church cemetery where she'd attended services her whole adult life. I knelt down in the fresh grass and placed a black pearl I'd collected from Mangareva Island in the soil beside her headstone. "I don't know what happened out there, Grandma," I whispered. "I don't know if I believe, not the way you wanted me to, but I'm not so sure anymore either. That was almost a year ago." I still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Could it have been a dream? Maybe a coincidence? Possibly. My grief manifesting itself in a moment of stress? Perhaps. But none of those explanations feel right. None of them account for the clarity of her voice, the specific timing, the fact that it was her younger voice I heard, a voice I hadn't heard in over 20 years. I'm not saying I've become a convert. I still have my doubts about heaven and angels and all the things my grandmother believed in so firmly. But I'm not as certain in my disbelief as I once was. There's a crack in my skepticism now, a space where questions live that I can't answer. Sometimes at night when I'm drifting off to sleep, I find myself listening, wondering if I'll hear her voice again. I never have. Maybe that one message was all she needed to keep her promise. All I know is that somewhere between the rolling waves off the coast of Namibia and a little house in Cairo, Illinois, something happened that science can't explain. And maybe that's enough to keep me wondering about what else might be possible. What else might be waiting beyond what we can see. Story 6. I haven't shared this with many people because honestly, I'm not sure how to explain it even now. I've been browsing this community for months, and some of your stories have finally given me the courage to write about what happened to me as a child. I'm 31 now, but these memories are still so vivid they make my skin crawl. When I was 4 years old, I started having these recurring nightmares that continued until I was 6. They weren't just regular bad dreams. They were experiences so real and terrifying that I still remember them clearly 25 years later. It always involved the same thing. I called it the man with the soft face. I know that sounds almost silly, but there was nothing funny about him. He was tall, towering over me at what I now estimate was around 6'5". His skin wasn't normal. It had this pinkish-brown color that reminded me of raw hamburger meat that had been left out too long, but it was his face that made me wake up screaming night after night. His eyes bulged out of his head like they were being pushed from inside, and they were completely empty. Not just vacant like someone spaced out, but literally devoid of any emotion or recognition. They were just there, staring. His nose was round and red like a clown's, but there was nothing jolly about it. And his mouth, God, his mouth, it stretched across his face in this impossibly wide smile filled with triangular teeth. Not pointed like fangs, but actual triangles, like someone had cut them out of construction paper and glued them in. The smile was the worst part. It was simultaneously happy and sadistic, like he was genuinely delighted about something horrible he was about to do. It hit that uncanny valley thing people talk about, where something looks almost human, but just wrong enough to be deeply disturbing. I noticed after a few dreams that his hands only had 4 fingers each. I remember this specifically because I'd count them when he grabbed me, hoping for some distraction from the terror. The dreams varied a little, but they always followed the same basic pattern. I'd be somewhere, usually my childhood bedroom or our living room, and suddenly he'd be there. No explanation, no entrance, just suddenly present. He'd reach for me with those 4-fingered hands, and I couldn't move fast enough to get away. He'd grab me, his grip firm but not painful, and start carrying me. Sometimes I'd try to fight back. I remember punching at his face once. That's how he got his name. My little fist just sank into his cheek like it was made of bubblegum or clay. It didn't hurt him. It didn't even seem to bother him. My hand just pushed into his flesh, and when I pulled it back, his face would slowly reform, that terrible smile never faltering. Sometimes he wouldn't say anything, just carry me silently to some unknown destination. Other times he'd stand behind me, his long arms wrapping around to choke me. Not hard enough to cut off my breathing completely, but enough to let me know he could if he wanted to. All the while, that smile remained fixed on his face. There was one dream that was more vivid than all the others. I must have been close to 6 because it was near the end of when these nightmares were happening. In this dream, I was outside on a snowy street at night. The streetlights cast these yellow pools of light on the pristine white snow. I wasn't walking, I was being carried by him. I could hear his footsteps crunching in the snow beneath us. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Even now, I hate that sound when I'm walking in snow at night. We passed buildings and more streetlights, and I remember feeling the cold on my face while the rest of me was uncomfortably warm from contact with his body. The warmth wasn't comforting. It felt wrong, like his body temperature was too high, almost feverish. After what felt like forever of walking, he stopped. I remember the sudden silence when his footsteps ceased. Then I heard more crunching coming toward us. Another figure emerged from the darkness between two streetlights. This one was similar to my captor, but with one significant difference. He had a long, protruding nose like Pinocchio, not wooden, but the same fleshy, pinkish-brown material as the rest of his face, just extended outward unnaturally. The soft-faced man shifted me in his arms, presenting me to this newcomer like I was some kind of offering or prize. They started talking to each other, but this is where things get fuzzy. I can't remember their voices. I know words were exchanged, but it's like my brain has deliberately erased that part of the memory. I just remember watching their mouths move, those triangular teeth visible as they spoke, but the sound is completely gone from my recollection. The Pinocchio-nosed one reached out and touched my head with one of his four-fingered hands. His touch was cold, unlike the soft-faced man's feverish warmth. That's the last thing I remember from that particular dream. When I woke up after that dream, I was drenched in sweat, and my throat was raw from screaming. My mom came in and held me, trying to comfort me. She asked what I'd dreamed about, and I told her about the man with the soft face. She thought it was just a normal nightmare, maybe inspired by a cartoon character or something I'd seen on TV. But we didn't have cable, and my parents were strict about what shows I watched. There was nothing in my limited media exposure that could have inspired something so specific and terrifying. I drew pictures of him once. My mom found them and was concerned enough to talk to our family doctor about it at my next checkup. He said it was probably just an overactive imagination, that kids often have vivid dreams and night terrors. He suggested limiting scary stories before bed and creating a more soothing bedtime routine. None of that helped. The dreams continued regularly, at least once a week, sometimes more frequently if I was stressed or sick. I developed elaborate rituals before bed, checking under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. I had a specific arrangement of stuffed animals that I believed would protect me. I'd recite little made-up prayers asking to not see him that night. Looking back, it was clearly anxiety-driven behavior, but at the time, it felt necessary for survival. The dreams finally stopped just after I turned 6. Not gradually, they just ceased completely. 1 week I was having them regularly, and then nothing. I kept up my bedtime safety rituals for months afterward, afraid he'd come back, but he never did. I've tried researching this over the years. I've looked into sleep paralysis, night terrors, and various folklore creatures, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The closest thing might be descriptions of the smiling man that some people have encountered, but even that doesn't capture the soft, malleable quality of this entity's face. What's strange is that despite not having these dreams for 25 years, I can still picture him perfectly. The details haven't faded like normal childhood memories. I can close my eyes right now and see those bulging, empty eyes staring at me, that wide smile with triangular teeth, those four-fingered hands reaching out. I've spoken to a therapist about this, wondering if these might have been manifestations of some childhood anxiety or fear. She suggested they could have been symbolic. The feeling of being taken away representing fear of abandonment, perhaps, but that doesn't explain the specific, consistent details across dozens of dreams, or why they started and stopped so abruptly. Sometimes I wonder if other children saw him too. There's something about him that feels almost archetypal, like he could be visiting other kids' dreams even now. The thought makes me shudder. The worst part is, I'm expecting my first child in a few months. My wife and I are having a son, and I find myself lying awake at night wondering, what if these dreams are hereditary somehow? What if when my son turns 4, the man with the soft face starts visiting him too? How would I even begin to protect him from something that exists in dreams? I've never found an explanation for what happened during those 2 years of my childhood. Were they just nightmares or something more? Why were they so consistent, so detailed, and why did they stop so suddenly? And why, after all these years, do I still sometimes catch myself checking the darker corners of rooms, half expecting to see that wide, unnatural smile emerging from the shadows? Sometimes I think I hear snow crunching outside my window on winter nights, even when there's no one there, and in those moments, I'm 4 years old again, being carried through the snow by something that shouldn't exist, being taken to God knows where for God knows what purpose. I still don't know what would have happened if we had reached our destination. Alert on Story 7. I've never shared this story with anyone except my therapist, but I think it's time. This happened when I was 6 years old, and even now, more than 20 years later, I still get chills thinking about it. I was going through a phase where I couldn't sleep in my own room. My parents had tried everything. Night lights, leaving the door open, checking under the bed for monsters before tucking me in. But nothing worked. Every night, I'd end up crawling into their bed around midnight, shaking and teary-eyed. Eventually, they just gave up and let me sleep in their room from the start. My dad was this big outdoorsy guy who was obsessed with tigers, like seriously obsessed. Our house wasn't exactly fancy, but their bedroom was pretty spacious with this huge king bed in the middle. The walls were covered with at least 7 or 8 different tiger paintings. Some were realistic wildlife portraits, others were more artistic interpretations, but my dad treasured each one. There was this massive full-body mirror on the left wall. You know, one of those old-fashioned standing ones that tilt slightly. Mom always said it made the room look bigger. That morning, God, I remember it so clearly. I woke up alone in their bedroom. It was a Tuesday in summer, and both my parents had already left for work. Dad worked construction, and Mom had the early shift at the hospital. The house was completely silent except for the ceiling fan, which made this soft whooshing sound as it spun overhead. The blades created moving shadows that danced across the walls and floor. I remember feeling drowsy and comfortable, that perfect state where you're half awake but still wrapped in the warmth of sleep. The sheets were tangled around my legs, and the pillows still smelled like my mom's shampoo. I was facing the mirror, and that's when I saw it. One of the tiger paintings, the one directly across from the mirror, looked wrong. So wrong. Instead of the orange and black stripes, the painting showed what looked like a mangled human face. It wasn't just like someone had replaced the painting with a different one. No, it was as if the tiger itself had morphed into this thing. The face was distorted, with skin that seemed to sag and twist unnaturally. The eyes, though, the eyes were perfectly human and alert, staring directly at me with an intensity I've never seen before or since. I couldn't move. Literally could not move a muscle. It wasn't like when you're having a nightmare and try to run but can't. This was different. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, pinned to the mattress by some invisible force. My throat closed up, and I couldn't even scream. The only thing I could do was slowly pull the blanket over my head, leaving just enough space for my eyes to peek out. My small fingers clutched the edge of the blanket so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My palms were sweating, making the fabric damp, but I didn't dare loosen my grip. From underneath my cotton shield, I watched the mirror. The face in the reflection continued to stare, unblinking. It didn't move or change expression. It just watched me with those piercing eyes. The tiger's stripes were still faintly visible, like they were trying to reassert themselves over the human features, creating this grotesque blend of animal and person. I started counting in my head, trying to distract myself, hoping my parents would come home early. 1 minute turned to 5, then 10, then 30. The digital clock on my dad's nightstand silently tracked the passing time as the morning sun shifted through the window, changing the light in the room. I remember my legs starting to cramp from staying in the same position for so long. My bladder was full, but there was no way I was getting out of that bed. Not with that thing watching me. The blanket had become stifling, my breath making the small space hot and humid, but I didn't dare move it. After what felt like forever, the clock showed it had been over an hour, I realized I needed to do something. My parents wouldn't be home for hours. I couldn't stay frozen like this all day. I tried reasoning with myself. Maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. But every time I looked at the mirror, that face was still there, still watching, its gaze seeming to grow more intense with each passing minute. I started whispering to myself, barely audible even to my own ears. It's not real, it's not real, it's not real. But it looks so real. The texture of skin, the depth in those eyes. How could my imagination create something so detailed and horrifying? Another 30 minutes passed. The fan continued its monotonous rotation, clicking slightly on each turn, which normally would have been annoying but now felt like the only normal thing in the room. Finally, I gathered whatever courage a terrified 6-year-old could muster. I decided I needed to look at the actual painting, not its reflection. Maybe then I'd see it was all in my head. With my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, I slowly, inch by inch, turned my head to the right, away from the mirror, toward where the painting hung on the wall, and there it was. Just a normal tiger painting, orange and black stripes, fierce yellow eyes, sharp teeth bared in a frozen roar, exactly as it had always been. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes and looked again. Still just a tiger, nothing human about it at all. The relief that washed over me was so intense that I actually started crying. It was like all the fear that had been building up inside me for the past hour and a half suddenly drained away, leaving me exhausted but somehow lighter. It felt like the painting, or whatever I'd seen in the mirror, had been feeding on my terror, and now that I'd broken its spell, it had nothing left to sustain itself. Cautiously, I looked back at the mirror. The reflection now showed exactly what should have been there, just the regular tiger painting. No face, no eyes, no horror. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the bathroom, then spent the rest of the day in the living room with every light turned on, watching cartoons at a volume that was probably way too loud. When my mom came home, I didn't tell her anything. What would I even say? The tiger painting turned into a scary face, but only in the mirror. I'd already been having trouble sleeping. This would just make them worry more. That night, I slept in my own room for the first time in weeks. Something about that bedroom, that mirror, that painting, I couldn't bear to be in there anymore. My parents were surprised but relieved, thinking I'd finally outgrown my fear. But I hadn't outgrown anything. I'd just found something much scarier than the monsters I imagined living in my closet. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what happened. As I got older, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a half-dream state, a child's mind playing tricks on itself. I even tested it once when I was 12, standing in front of that same mirror, looking at the reflection of that same painting. Nothing happened. It was just a tiger. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm visiting my parents and walk past their bedroom, I swear I can feel eyes on me. Not from the painting itself, but from its reflection in that old mirror. Was it a tired mind playing tricks? Some kind of waking nightmare? Or was it something else? Something that chose to reveal itself only to a child, something that could only exist in the space between reality and reflection. I still don't have answers. My rational adult mind says it was nothing, just the vivid imagination of a sleep-deprived kid. But that small, still 6-year-old part of me knows what I saw. It remembers the weight of that gaze, the wrongness of that face, the way it seemed to feed on my fear. To this day, I don't trust mirrors in rooms with artwork. I've even arranged my own apartment so that no mirrors reflect any of my pictures or paintings. My girlfriend thinks it's just some weird design preference, but how do I explain that I'm afraid of what might be looking back? I keep wondering if it was trying to communicate something to me, or if it was simply hungry. And sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, I wonder if it's still there, waiting for me to look again, to provide it with the fear it seemed to crave. Whatever it was, it changed me. There's a reason I still sleep with a nightlight at 28 years old. There's a reason I always check mirrors before I fully enter a room. Some experiences leave marks that never fully heal, questions that never find answers, and sometimes I still dream about those eyes watching me from behind a tiger's face. Story 8. I'm still shaking a bit as I type this, even though it happened back when I was 13, around 2014 or 2015. I've tried telling this story to friends, but they always think I'm making it up or exaggerating. I'm not. I know what I saw. My aunt and her family were pretty religious and went to church every Sunday. Usually I'd go with them since I was staying at their apartment that summer, but this particular Sunday I just wasn't feeling it. I told my aunt I felt a little sick, which wasn't completely untrue. I had a headache, and asked if I could stay home. She hesitated but eventually agreed since I was old enough to look after myself for a few hours. After they left, I sprawled out on their big brown couch in the living room. It was probably around 11 in the morning, and I had the whole place to myself except for my cousin's dog, a little terrier mix named Baxter. He was curled up next to me while I scrolled through Netflix and found Malcolm in the Middle. I'd been binging it lately and was a few seasons in. The apartment was pretty standard. Living room connected to a small kitchen with a hallway that led to the bedrooms and bathroom. From where I was sitting on the couch, I could see straight down that hallway. My aunt's room was at the very end, my cousin's room was on the right side of the hallway, and the guest room where I was staying was on the left. The bathroom was right across from my room. I remember feeling super comfortable just chilling with Baxter and watching TV. No responsibilities, no church, just me and a lazy Sunday. I was about 3 episodes in when Baxter got up, stretched, and trotted off down the hallway. I figured he was going to sleep on one of the beds. He usually did that when he wanted some quiet time. I kept watching the show, half paying attention, half daydreaming. Then I heard it, a loud slam that made me jump. It was my bedroom door, just slam, like someone had thrown it shut with all their strength. At first I thought maybe there was a window open somewhere causing a draft, but then I remembered my aunt was super paranoid about safety and never left windows open when no one was home. Plus, it was the middle of summer in Arizona. Nobody opens windows in that heat. I paused the TV and sat up, listening. The apartment was dead quiet. I debated whether to go check it out or just ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the door wasn't latched properly and finally fell shut. But something felt off. I was just about to get up when I heard Baxter bark. It wasn't his usual excited bark when someone came home or when he saw a squirrel out the window. It was just one sharp, alarmed bark, then nothing. Complete silence. That's when I got my first real chill. Dogs don't just bark once and shut up like that. I called out, "Baxter?" My voice sounded weird and small in the quiet apartment. No response, not even the jingling of his collar tags. I turned back to the TV, trying to convince myself everything was fine, but I couldn't focus on the show anymore. I kept glancing down the hallway, feeling like I needed to keep an eye on it. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the end of the hallway, where it opened into the living room, something peeked around the corner. Just for a second, a flash of white. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. Something pale moved at the edge of the wall. I sat completely still, remote clutched in my hand as more of it came into view. It was a face, a woman's face, but wrong. Her skin was the whitest white I've ever seen. Not like pale skin, but like actual white paint. Her eyes were huge and completely black, no whites at all, and her hair was long and dark and looked wet, like she'd just stepped out of a shower. She was peeking around the corner with just her face showing, staring right at the TV. Not at me, but near me. The moment I turned my head to look directly at her, she disappeared back behind the wall. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a shadow or a reflection from the TV. I forced myself to look back at the screen, but I wasn't seeing anything that was happening on the show anymore. My eyes kept darting back to that corner of the hallway. Then she came back. This time she revealed more of herself. Her hands came around the wall first, white like her face, with long, almost transparent fingers that gripped the edge of the wall. They didn't look like normal hands. The fingers were too long, too clear at the tips, like icicles. Then her face appeared again, showing up to her nose. Those black eyes stared straight ahead, not blinking. Her wet-looking hair hung down along the wall. I looked directly at her again, and just like before, she quickly pulled back out of sight. My breath was coming in quick gasps now. I was terrified, but also trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was someone playing a prank? Had someone broken in? But nobody I knew looked like that. And why would a burglar be playing peekaboo instead of just robbing the place? I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up from the couch, ran to the front door, and flung it open. The bright sunlight and normal sounds of the apartment complex, kids playing, someone grilling, cars driving by, felt surreal compared to the silence and wrongness inside. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called my mom. When she answered, I tried to sound casual, but my voice cracked as I asked if she could come pick me up. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. I think someone's in the apartment," I whispered, stepping out onto the landing but keeping the door open so I could watch inside. "What? Call 911, she said. "No, it's not. It's not a person. I mean, it doesn't look like a normal person." I couldn't explain it without sounding crazy. My mom went quiet for a second. "Is the door locked? Can you get out?" "I'm outside now, but I don't want to close the door. I'm scared." She said she'd come get me, but it would take about half an hour since she was across town. I didn't want to sound like a baby, so I told her I'd be fine. I'd just wait with the door open. So that's what I did. I sat on the top step outside the apartment, the door wide open behind me, too afraid to go back in, but also too afraid to close the door and not know what was happening inside. Every few minutes I'd turn around and look, but I never saw the white lady again. Baxter never came out either, which worried me. I called his name a few times, but he didn't appear. My aunt and her family got home around 6 in the evening before my mom could come get me. I was still sitting outside when their car pulled up. My cousin saw me first and asked why I was sitting outside. I made up something about getting fresh air. Once we were all inside, Baxter finally appeared from my cousin's room, acting completely normal. My aunt asked if everything was okay, and I hesitated. I didn't want to freak them out or make them think I was crazy, but something in me needed to know if I was the only one who had seen her. "Did something weird ever happen in this apartment?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Like, have you ever seen anything strange? My aunt was unpacking some leftover food from after church, but she stopped and looked at me with this expression I'll never forget, like she knew exactly what I was asking. "What did you see?" she asked quietly. That's when I broke down and told her everything. The slammed door, Baxter's weird behavior, and the white lady peeking around the corner. I expected her to laugh or tell me I had an overactive imagination. Instead, she sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "You saw her too," she said. It wasn't a question. My skin went cold. "Too? You mean you've seen her?" She nodded. "A few times. Always when I'm alone. I hear footsteps sometimes, and twice when I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning and saw her standing in the kitchen staring at me." "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, feeling betrayed that she'd let me stay home alone without warning me. "I thought it was stress or bad dreams," she said, "and I didn't want to scare you kids, but now that you've seen her too." She trailed off, looking troubled. They moved out of that apartment about 6 months later. My aunt said it was because they needed more space, but I always wondered if the white lady had something to do with it. After they moved, my cousin told me they found out an old woman had died in that apartment before they moved in. She had lived there alone for years. I don't know if that explains what I saw, but it makes me wonder. I've had a few other weird experiences in my life. Shadows moving when they shouldn't, voices when no one's there, but nothing has stuck with me like the white lady. Sometimes I still dream about those black eyes and long, clear fingers gripping the wall. And sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I get this feeling that if I look at the doorway, I might see her peeking around the corner again, watching me with those empty black eyes. I don't tell many people about this because I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw that Sunday, and now you do too. I just wish I knew who or what she was and what she wanted from me. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not even sure if anyone will believe me, but I need to get this off my chest. I can't talk to my family about it. They'd think I'm losing it. My friends just laugh it off as me being dramatic. But I know what I experienced was real, and it still haunts me. I worked at the Oakwood Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for just over 2 years. It's nestled deep in the woods of eastern Oklahoma, about 20 minutes from the nearest streetlight or gas station. The facility sits on top of a hill, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It's beautiful during the day. All those trees, the sounds of birds, the occasional deer at the tree line. But at night, that place transforms into something else entirely. What most visitors don't know is that the land the center was built on was once part of the Trail of Tears. Yeah, that Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans were forced to march westward, many dying along the way. I only found out about this history after working there for about 6 months, when my supervisor Carol mentioned it casually during a slow afternoon. "Just so you know, Cassandra," she said while we were cleaning cages, "some of the staff feel uncomfortable here after dark. The land has history." I thought she was just trying to spook me because I was still the new girl. I brushed it off and continued my closing shift duties. I worked 11 in the morning until 9 at night, though I often stayed later because of the animals needing care. Some nights I wouldn't leave until 1 or 2 in the morning, especially during baby season when we had dozens of orphaned raccoons, squirrels, and opossums to bottle feed every few hours. The first weird thing I noticed was the doorbell. Our facility closed to the public at 5 p.m., and by 8 everyone except the closing staff had gone home. But at least twice a week the doorbell would ring around 10 p.m. Every single time I'd check the security camera, see no one, and cautiously open the door to find an empty parking lot. No cars, no people, not even footprints in the muddy areas near the entrance during rainy seasons. After the 3rd or 4th time it happened, I mentioned it to my coworker Jen. "Oh yeah, the ghost doorbell," she said with uncomfortable laughter. "We all just ignore it now," but I couldn't ignore the feeling that would settle over the building after about 8:30 every night. It was like the air got heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I constantly felt like I was being watched. I'd catch movements from the corner of my eye, a shadow passing a doorway, a dark figure standing at the end of a hallway, gone when I turned my head. I remember one night specifically. It was the middle of summer, and I was alone in the facility. Everyone else had gone home, but I had to stay to feed the baby raccoons at midnight. I was in the kitchen, warming formula in the microwave, when I noticed a reflection in the microwave door. There was a silhouette of someone standing behind me, tall with broad shoulders. I spun around, heart pounding, but found empty space. Just the humming of the microwave and me, alone in that kitchen. I called my boyfriend right away, keeping him on speaker while I finished feeding the raccoons. I was shaking so badly I spilled formula on my scrubs. The next morning, I asked around if anyone else had experienced anything strange. Most people avoided the question or gave me vague answers, but Mike, who'd worked there for 15 years, finally opened up. "There's a woman many of us have seen," he said quietly, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "Native American, wearing traditional buckskin. She walks through the hallways sometimes, or stands in the laundry room folding blankets. When you try to talk to her, she vanishes." I hadn't seen her yet, but knowing others had experienced things made me feel less crazy. Over the next few months, 3 other staff members reported seeing her. One quit the next day. The storage building was the worst, though. It sat about 50 yards from the main facility, a small single-story structure that had once housed interns but now stored extra supplies and equipment. Every time I had to walk past it, my skin would crawl. Something about it felt wrong, like it was watching me. I'd run past it even in broad daylight, feeling foolish but unable to shake the dread it inspired. I later learned why interns no longer stayed there. About 5 years before I started, two female interns had been sleeping in the building when they both woke up to find a man standing in their doorway, just staring at them. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. They called security, but when the guard arrived, there was no one there. The doors had been locked from the inside, the windows secured. There was no way anyone could have entered or left without the interns knowing. After that incident, the center converted the building to storage and moved the intern housing to the main facility. By far the most terrifying experience happened during a summer camp we hosted for local kids. I was supervising nap time for the 5-year-olds in one of our older classrooms. All 12 children were sleeping on their mats, and I was catching up on paperwork at the small desk in the corner. It was about 1 in the afternoon when the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. I mean literally dropped. I could see my breath fogging in front of my face, even though it was July in Oklahoma. The air felt dense, almost electric, and I had that familiar sensation of being watched. I glanced at the kids, making sure they were all still asleep, when I heard something move in the attached bathroom. It sounded like someone was opening drawers, shifting items around. I froze, unsure what to do. The only entrance to that bathroom was through the classroom, and nobody had walked past me. I was about to get up and check when one of the children sat straight up on his mat. This kid, Ethan, was autistic and rarely spoke. He'd been with us all week and had barely said 2 words, but now he was upright, eyes wide with terror, staring at a spot near the bathroom door where I could see nothing. Then he pointed and screamed. Not just any scream, the kind that makes your blood turn to ice. Pure, primal fear. The other kids startled awake, confused and scared because of Ethan's reaction. I ran to him, kneeling beside his mat and pulling him close. He was rigid with fear, still pointing at that empty space by the bathroom. But it wasn't empty to him. He could see something there that I couldn't, and whatever it was terrified him beyond words. I don't know what came over me, but I looked right at that spot and said firmly, "Get out, leave him alone." My voice was shaking but loud enough to carry through the room. "You don't belong here. Get out now." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the cold air seemed to recede, like someone had opened a door to summer. Ethan relaxed in my arms, his breathing slowed, and he looked at me with the clearest expression I'd seen on his face all week. "Gone," he whispered, the first word I'd heard him speak. "Lady gone." I reported the incident to my supervisor, who seemed unsurprised. She told me that children often see things adults can't, and left it at that. But I knew what had happened in that room wasn't normal. Something or someone had been there with us. After that day, I started noticing more frequent occurrences: footsteps in empty hallways, doors closing on their own, the sensation of someone breathing down my neck when I worked late. Equipment that had been put away neatly would be found scattered across the floor in the morning. One night, while doing the final raccoon feeding around midnight, I distinctly heard someone call my name from the dark hallway leading to the raptor rehabilitation area. It was a woman's voice, soft but clear. I knew I was alone in the building. I'd locked up myself. I didn't answer, just quickly finished feeding the animals and got out of there as fast as I could. The next day, 2 volunteers quit after claiming they saw a dark shadow person following them around the bird nursery. They described feeling an overwhelming sadness that wasn't their own emotion. I started researching the history of the land more deeply. It turns out the hill our facility sat on was once used as a temporary camp during the forced removal of the Cherokee in the winter of 1838 to 1839-39. Historical accounts mentioned that dozens had died there from exposure and disease before the rest were forced to continue their journey. I lasted 6 more months after the incident with Ethan. What finally broke me was finding small handprints in the dust of the storage building, child-sized handprints that appeared overnight when no children had been in that building for years. They were pressed into a thick layer of dust on an old metal cabinet, perfectly formed, as if a child had leaned there moments before. But the building had been locked, alarms set, untouched for weeks. I quit the following day. I couldn't handle it anymore. The constant feeling of dread, of being watched, of knowing something was there but not being able to see it most of the time. It's been 8 months since I left. I still have nightmares about that place. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I'm back in that wildlife center with something standing over my bed, watching me. I've moved twice since then, but the feeling follows me. I still don't have explanations for what happened there. All I know is that place is haunted, not by just one spirit, but many. Whatever tragedy occurred on that land left an imprint that refuses to fade, and sometimes, when the conditions are right, that imprint becomes strong enough for us to sense it or even see it. I'm writing this from my new apartment 3 states away. I don't work with wildlife anymore. Couldn't bring myself to go back to that field. But even here, sometimes my doorbell rings when no one is there, and I can't help but wonder if something followed me home from that hill in Oklahoma. Story 10. I still can't explain what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it countless times, tried to convince myself it was just shadows or my imagination playing tricks after working a long shift. But I know what I saw, and I still see them sometimes. I live in a small river town in Missouri, one of those places where everybody knows everybody, where Main Street is actually called Main Street, and where the high school football games are the biggest event of the week. I've lived here my whole life, 24 years now. It's not exciting, but it's home. I work nights at Riverfront Pizza, a local joint that's been around since the 80s. Nothing fancy, just good pizza in a building that's seen better days. The hours suck, but the tips are decent, and Mike, the owner, is cool about letting me pick up extra shifts when I need the money. The old grain mill stands at the edge of town, this massive brick building that's been there since before my grandparents were born. Half of it got converted into a community hall maybe 15 years ago where they hold town meetings, wedding receptions, stuff like that. The other half is just empty, broken windows, pigeons nesting in the rafters, floors that probably aren't safe to walk on anymore. It was a Tuesday night in October when I first noticed something weird. Not Halloween or anything, just a regular Tuesday about 3 years ago. We'd closed the pizza place at 11 and I was waiting for Mike to finish the deposit so he could give me a ride home. My car was in the shop and I didn't feel like walking the 1.5 miles in the cold. I was leaning against the building, scrolling through my phone when movement caught my eye across the street. At first, I thought it was just some teenagers. We've got these local kids who think it's cool to climb on the rooftops downtown. Drives the sheriff crazy. But this was different. The shape I saw was moving across the top of the hardware store, but not like a person moves. It was jerky, like fast but weirdly slow at the same time, if that makes any sense, like skipping frames in a video, and it wasn't going from rooftop to rooftop like the kids do. It was just gliding across, then disappeared at the edge. I blinked, thinking maybe I was just tired, but then I saw another one, moving the same way across the roof of the bank building 2 doors down, and another on the old post office, all moving in the same direction, toward the mill. Mike came out just then, locking the door behind him. "Ready to go, kid?" he asked, jingling his keys. I almost pointed out what I was seeing, but something stopped me. Instead, I just nodded and followed him to his truck. The whole ride home, I couldn't stop thinking about those shapes. The next night was my day off, but I picked up a shift on Thursday. Same routine, close up, wait for Mike. But this time, I deliberately positioned myself where I could see the rooftops. For almost 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to give up, there they were again. In the moonlight, I could see them more clearly. They weren't just shapeless blobs like I'd first thought. They had form, human form, but not quite right. The proportions were off somehow, and they weren't just moving randomly. They were definitely heading toward the mill, all of them. The really freaky part? Some of them seemed to be carrying something long and thin. At first, I thought maybe pipes or poles, but as one passed under a streetlight, I realized with a chill what it was. A rifle, an old-fashioned one, like from the Civil War or maybe early 1900s. I didn't say anything to Mike that night either. What was I going to say? Hey, I think I'm seeing ghost soldiers on the rooftops. He'd think I was high or something. Instead, I went to the library the next day and looked up the history of our town. I'd learned some of it in school, but I wanted details about the mill specifically. The librarian, Mrs. Henson, who's known me since I was a kid, helped me find some old newspapers and a local history book. Turns out, the mill was built in 1872. It was the center of commerce for the whole county back then. Farmers would bring their grain to be processed, and it would get loaded onto trains that ran on tracks behind the mill. Those tracks are long gone now, paved over for a parking lot decades ago. The book mentioned that during World War I, the mill was temporarily used as a gathering point for local soldiers before they shipped out to training camps. There was a photo of maybe 30 guys in uniform standing in front of the mill, looking serious but excited. Most of them probably had no idea what they were in for. There was also a small paragraph about a train accident in 1923. A freight train derailed just behind the mill, killing the engineer and 2 workers who were loading flour. The book didn't go into details, but I found an old newspaper article that said the bodies were grievously mangled. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those shapes on the rooftops and their old rifles. Could they be soldiers from World War I, or maybe workers from the train accident? But why would they be moving across rooftops instead of just walking on the ground? The weekend passed without me seeing anything unusual, mainly because I was working day shifts. But the following Tuesday I was closing again, and Mike had to leave early for a family thing. He left me the keys to lock up and said he'd get them from me tomorrow. So there I was, alone at 11:15 at night, pulling down the metal security gate over the front door of Riverfront Pizza. The street was completely empty, not unusual for a weeknight in our town. Most places close by 9, and by 11, even the bar crowd has usually headed home. I heard it before I saw anything, a strange sound like fabric rustling in the wind, but there was no wind that night. The air was completely still, almost heavy. I looked up and nearly dropped the keys. They were everywhere, at least a dozen of the shapes, all moving across different buildings, all heading toward the mill. In the stillness of the night, I could hear other sounds now too. A faint clicking that might have been boots on shingles, and something that sounded almost like muffled voices, though I couldn't make out any words. One of them passed directly overhead, moving across the roof of the pizza place. I pressed myself against the door, heart pounding. From that angle, I could see the underside of it, just a silhouette against the night sky, but definitely human-shaped. It seemed to be wearing some kind of uniform and was definitely carrying a rifle. I should have run. I should have gotten in my car and driven home as fast as possible. Instead, something compelled me to follow them. Not closely, I'm not that stupid, but I had to know where they were going, what they were doing. I stayed on the sidewalk, keeping to the shadows, and made my way toward the mill. It's only about 4 blocks from the pizza place, but that night it felt like miles. The shapes had all disappeared by the time I got there, but the air around the building felt charged somehow, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The community hall part of the mill was dark, no events that night. The abandoned section loomed above, its broken windows like empty eye sockets. I stood across the street watching, not sure what I expected to see. That's when I heard the train. Not a real train. There haven't been trains through our town in at least 40 years. But the sound was unmistakable. The chug of an engine, the squeal of metal wheels on tracks, even a distant whistle. It seemed to be coming from behind the mill, where the tracks used to be. I crossed the street, drawn to the sound like a moth to flame. The sensible part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. The parking lot behind the mill was empty and dark. The street light at the corner had burned out weeks ago, and no one had bothered to replace it. I used my phone's flashlight, sweeping it across the cracked asphalt where train tracks had once been. Nothing, just empty pavement. But the sound of the train was louder here, and now there were other noises too. Men shouting, the creak of wagon wheels, the thud of heavy objects being moved. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and scared in the darkness. The sound stopped abruptly. Complete silence fell, the kind that makes your ears ring. I swung my flashlight around frantically, but there was nothing to see. Then the temperature dropped. I'm not talking about a slight chill. It was like stepping into a freezer. My breath clouded in front of my face, and frost actually formed on my phone screen. In October, in Missouri. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on whatever this was. As I reached the corner of the building, I heard a new sound. Footsteps. Heavy boots on pavement, coming toward me. My flashlight beam shook wildly as my hand trembled, but it illuminated nothing. The footsteps stopped directly in front of me. I could feel a presence there just beyond the reach of my light. Something cold brushed against my arm, and I lost it. I turned and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, all the way back to my car. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up with shaking hands, and finally got the door open. As I started the engine, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw figures standing in the middle of the street, men in old-fashioned uniforms, rifles at their sides. Then I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? This isn't the kind of town where people talk about ghosts or supernatural stuff, except maybe as jokes around Halloween. But I started paying attention to patterns. I noticed that the shapes appear most often on Tuesday nights, though sometimes on Thursdays too. Always after 11, always heading toward the mill. I did more research and found that the train that used to run through town arrived at the mill at 11:30 on Tuesday and Thursday nights to pick up flour shipments. It's been 3 years now, and I still see them sometimes. Not as often as that first week, but they're still around. I've gotten braver too. I've gone back to the mill at night, stood in that parking lot and listened to the ghostly train that no one else seems to hear. Once, I even took a photo, but all that showed up was a strange blur of light where I'd seen one of the figures. Sometimes on very still nights, especially in fall, I can hear the train whistle from my apartment, even though I live on the opposite side of town from where the tracks used to be. I've learned to accept it as just part of living here, like the river flooding every spring or the high school marching band practicing too early on Saturday mornings. I don't know who they are. Soldiers waiting for a train that will take them to war, workers who died in the accident, or something else entirely. I don't know why they travel across rooftops instead of streets, or why they only appear on certain nights. All I know is that in our quiet river town, when the rest of the world is asleep, something makes its way to the old mill, and whatever business they have there, it's been unfinished for a very long time. Story 11. I never thought I'd be the person typing something like this. I've always been pretty logical, the kind of person who looks for rational explanations. But what's been happening in my house lately? I just need to get this off my chest because I'm honestly scared and confused. It all started yesterday morning. Actually, no, that's not true. The weird stuff has been happening for months now, but yesterday was when things escalated to a point where I can't ignore it anymore. Some background. I live in a pretty normal suburban house in Portland. Nothing fancy, nothing historically significant, just a regular 2-story home built in the early 90s. 3 years ago, I lost my puppy, Max, to a horrible degenerative disease. He was only 8 months old. The vet said it was genetic, nothing I could have done, but I was devastated. I'd never connected with an animal like I connected with Max. After he passed, I wanted something to remember him by. The vet helped me make a paw print impression before they took him away, and I preserved it in this glass jar that I kept on my dresser. It sounds weird maybe, but it brought me comfort. I got another dog about a year later, Buddy, a rescue mutt who's now about 2, but Max's paw print has always been special to me. Yesterday morning started normally. I woke up around 6:30, fed Buddy, and was getting ready for work in my bathroom. The dresser with Max's paw print jar is just outside the bathroom door. I remember glancing at it as I was brushing my teeth. I had recently placed the jar on top of this little angel photo my mom gave me. I'm not particularly religious, but the image was comforting somehow, and it seemed fitting to have it under Max's memorial. I was leaning over the sink, just finishing up, when I heard a weird scraping sound from my bedroom. Before I could even turn around, something hit me hard in the back of my head. The impact was so forceful that I stumbled forward, nearly hitting my face on the mirror. When I turned around, Max's jar was on the floor and the glass had cracked. The paw print was still intact inside, but the jar had somehow flown off my dresser and hit me with enough force to leave a small bump on the back of my head. The dresser is at least 8 feet from where I was standing. My first thought was that maybe Buddy had jumped up and knocked it off, but he was downstairs. I could hear his collar jingling in the kitchen. There are no windows open, no fans running, nothing that could have caused it to move. The dresser is completely flat and stable. The jar had been sitting right in the middle, on top of that angel picture. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't just that the jar had fallen. It had literally launched itself across the room with enough force to hurt me. I was shaking as I picked it up. This is when things got even weirder. As I was picking up the pieces of glass, I felt this intense cold spot right next to me. It was like standing next to an open freezer, but only in this one specific area about 3 feet wide. The rest of the room was normal temperature. I decided to call in sick to work. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I spent most of the morning trying to convince myself there was some logical explanation for what happened, but I couldn't come up with anything that made sense. Around noon, I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when Buddy started growling at the corner by the refrigerator. His hackles were up, and he was staring intently at absolutely nothing. This isn't completely unusual. Dogs sometimes fixate on random things, but what happened next made my blood run cold. As I was watching Buddy growl, I saw something move in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, I swear I saw what looked like a dark animal-shaped shadow dart across the floor and disappear behind the island. It wasn't a normal shadow. It was darker, more solid somehow, and it moved independently of any light source. I've seen these shadow things before, actually. Over the past few months, I've caught glimpses of what looked like shadowy animals moving around my kitchen and living room. Sometimes they're small, like cat-sized, but sometimes they're bigger. Once, about 3 weeks ago, I saw what looked like a person crawling on all fours across my living room floor. It moved like a dog, but had human proportions. When I turned on the light, it disappeared. I've been telling myself it's just my eyes playing tricks on me, maybe stress or lack of sleep. But yesterday it seemed so real, and Buddy clearly saw it too. I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself with TV, but I couldn't focus. Buddy kept staring at empty corners and occasionally growling at nothing. He does this almost every night, actually. He'll suddenly wake up from a dead sleep around 3 in the morning and bark frantically at an empty space in the living room. I always assumed he was dreaming, but now I'm not so sure. As it got dark outside, I started feeling more and more uneasy. I don't like being in my house at night anymore. There's this constant feeling of being watched, especially in my bedroom and the upstairs hallway. Around 9, I decided to make some popcorn and watch a movie, anything to take my mind off the weirdness. I was standing by the microwave when I heard this weird shuffling sound behind me. I turned around and saw nothing, but the temperature in the kitchen had dropped again. My breath was fogging in front of my face, even though it was July and about 75 degrees outside. I grabbed my popcorn and practically ran to the living room. I put on some stupid comedy, turned up the volume, and tried to relax. Buddy was curled up next to me, but he was tense, his eyes darting around the room. I was about halfway through the movie when the popcorn tub, a plastic container I was holding in my lap, suddenly flew out of my hands. It didn't just fall or get knocked over, it literally launched across the room as if someone had grabbed it and thrown it. Popcorn went everywhere, and the tub hit the wall with enough force to crack the plastic. I jumped up, heart pounding. Buddy started barking like crazy, running in circles around the room. I was so scared I could barely breathe. There was absolutely no explanation for what had just happened. No draft, no open windows, nothing that could have caused that tub to move like that. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom with Buddy whining outside the door. I just needed a minute to calm down. I sat on my bed trying to steady my breathing when I felt it, that sensation of being watched. It was so intense that the hair on my arms stood up. I looked toward my closet door, which was partially open, and that's when I saw it. The shadow figure, the one I've been seeing off and on for months. It's hard to describe exactly what it looks like. It's humanoid, about 6 feet tall, with a vaguely human shape. But its head is all wrong. It has these 3 cone-shaped protrusions, one on top and one on each side, that make it look almost like it's wearing some kind of weird crown or helmet. But it's not wearing anything. The shape is its head. It was standing perfectly still, just watching me. I couldn't see any eyes, but I knew it was looking right at me. The fear I felt was unlike anything I've ever experienced. Not just startled or scared, but a deep, primal terror that froze me in place. It didn't move. It didn't make any sound. It just stood there watching for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Then, as I finally managed to reach for my phone to turn on the flashlight, it just faded away. Not quickly, like a normal shadow when you turn on a light, but slowly, like ink dissolving in water. I slept on my couch last night, with all the lights on. Buddy refused to leave my side, which was somewhat comforting, but I kept waking up throughout the night, feeling like something was standing over me. Each time there was nothing there, at least nothing I could see, but the feeling of being watched never went away. This morning, I found Max's paw print jar on my dresser again. Not the broken one from yesterday, but a completely intact jar, exactly like the original, sitting in the exact same spot where it had been. The broken jar pieces I'd collected were still in my trash can. I have absolutely no explanation for this. I live alone except for Buddy, and no one else has a key to my house. I don't know what to do. I don't believe in ghosts or demons or whatever, but I can't explain what's happening. Is it connected to Max somehow? To his memorial? The shadow figures don't seem friendly, especially that humanoid one with the weird head. The incident with the jar hitting me and the popcorn flying across the room feel almost aggressive. I'm writing this from a coffee shop because I don't want to be in my house right now. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if something supernatural is actually happening. All I know is that I'm terrified to go home tonight, but I don't have anywhere else to go. Buddy is at daycare, and at least he'll be with me, but I don't know if that will be enough. Has anyone experienced anything like this? Does anyone know what that 3-cone shadow figure might be? I need help making sense of all this, because right now I feel like I'm losing my mind. Story 12. I've never told anyone about this except my immediate family, and they all think I'm just being dramatic. But I know what happened to me that Christmas break when I was 14, and no one can convince me it wasn't real. I'm 27 now, but I still get chills thinking about it. It was December of 2009, and we were visiting my stepmom's parents in Sequim, Washington for the holidays. If you've never been to Sequim, it's this small town on the Olympic Peninsula. Pretty place, but isolated, especially in winter when it gets dark by 4 in the afternoon and the fog rolls in from the water. Their house was this big old place from the 1970s, kind of remote, surrounded by these tall pines that always seemed to be whispering when the wind blew. My stepmom's parents had rented it as an Airbnb for the holidays since their regular place was being renovated. I remember thinking it was weird they didn't just have us all stay at a hotel, but my dad said this would be more family-like for Christmas. From the moment we pulled up, something felt off about that house. It was just too quiet inside, like the walls were absorbing sound. And it had this smell, not bad exactly, just old, like dusty curtains and furniture polish, and something else I couldn't place. The worst part was the basement. That's where I was sent to hang out while the adults did their Christmas prep upstairs. They had this old TV down there with a VCR, and I found a copy of Little Giants, which I was pretty stoked about since I loved that movie as a kid. The basement was finished, but still felt like a basement, you know, dropped ceiling with those white panels, thin carpet over concrete, and it was always a few degrees colder than the rest of the house. There was a small bathroom down there, which was convenient, but also meant I had to deal with the hallway. That hallway still shows up in my dreams sometimes. It wasn't even that long, maybe 15 feet, but it felt like a mile. It had 3 doors. A boiler room on the left, this unused bedroom on the right that was full of stored furniture and boxes, and then the bathroom straight ahead at the end. The hallway had no windows and just one of those dim lights that cast more shadows than it eliminated. On our 3rd night there, everyone went to bed early because we had plans to drive to Hurricane Ridge the next day. I wasn't tired, so I went down to the basement to watch my movie. About halfway through, I needed to use the bathroom. I paused the movie and walked down that hallway. I remember noticing how cold it was, even for a basement. My socks felt damp against the carpet. The bathroom was tiny, just a toilet, sink, and small shower stall. I did my business, washed my hands, turned off both faucets completely, dried my hands on this scratchy green towel hanging on the rack, switched off the light, and started back down the hallway. I'd only taken about 3 steps when I heard it. The sink had turned on behind me, not a drip or a trickle, but full blast. The sound of water hitting the basin echoed off the bathroom tiles. I froze. My first thought was that I'd somehow not turned it off properly, but I distinctly remembered turning both handles until they stopped. You know when you're absolutely certain you've done something? That's how I felt. As I stood there in the hallway, the air around me changed. It became so cold that I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. My back was to the bathroom, and I was facing the direction of the TV room, but something kept me from moving forward. That's when I felt it. What felt like cold fingers creeping up my spine, starting at the small of my back and slowly making their way up to the base of my skull. I can't explain how I knew, but something wanted me to turn around. Something was waiting for me to look back at the bathroom. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to do it, that whatever was behind me wasn't something I was supposed to see. My muscles locked up. I couldn't move forward, couldn't run, but I also couldn't bring myself to turn around. I just stood there, breath coming in short, visible puffs, listening to the water running full force in the sink behind me, feeling those invisible fingers pressing against my neck. The pressure on my neck increased, like whatever it was really wanted me to turn around. The air got even colder, and I swear the hallway seemed to stretch longer in front of me. The light from the TV room looked miles away. I don't know how long I stood there, probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. Finally, I managed to start walking, slowly at first, one foot in front of the other, focusing on just reaching the end of that hallway. I didn't run. Something told me running would be worse, would somehow acknowledge whatever was behind me and give it more power. When I finally reached the couch, I didn't sit down right away. I stood there, back still to the hallway, listening. The water was still running. The cold had followed me, but the sensation of fingers on my neck was gone. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown out the sound of the running water. I tried to convince myself it was just a faulty sink, old plumbing, pipes that knock and groan in old houses, but I knew better. After about 10 minutes of standing there, paralyzed with fear, I realized I had to go back. The water was still running, and if it flooded, I'd be in trouble. Plus, I couldn't hide in the TV room forever. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and walked back down the hallway. The cold intensified with every step. When I reached the bathroom door, I hesitated before flipping on the light. The sight made my stomach drop. Both faucet handles, hot and cold, were turned all the way on. Water was splashing over the edges of the basin onto the floor. There was no way, absolutely no way, I had left it like that. I hadn't even used the hot water when I washed my hands. I quickly turned both handles off, grabbed a towel from the rack, and mopped up the water on the floor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely wring out the towel. The whole time I felt like someone was watching me from the shower stall behind the curtain, but I couldn't bring myself to check. Once the water was cleaned up, I bolted out of there, ran upstairs, and found my dad in the kitchen getting a glass of water. I told him what happened, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like a scared little kid. He just laughed. "Old houses have weird plumbing, Danny. The handles probably weren't fully off and gradually turned themselves on from the pressure. I tried to explain that both handles had been on full blast, that the air had gone freezing cold, that I had felt something touch me, but he just ruffled my hair and told me to stop watching scary movies before bed. I hadn't even been watching a scary movie. I didn't sleep that night. I shared a room with my younger stepbrother who slept like a rock, completely unaware of me staring at the ceiling until morning. I kept thinking about those faucets turning on by themselves, about those cold fingers on my neck, about whatever wanted me to turn around in that hallway. The next morning, I refused to go back to the basement. I said I was feeling sick, which wasn't entirely a lie. My stepmom gave me a suspicious look, but let me hang out in the living room while everyone else went about their day. That evening, when everyone was in the kitchen helping prepare dinner, I overheard my stepmom's mom talking to my dad. She mentioned that the owners of the house had told them some silly story about previous renters complaining about strange occurrences in the basement. She laughed it off as people trying to get partial refunds on their stays. We left 2 days later, and I've never been so relieved to go home. I tried to forget about it, to accept my dad's explanation about faulty plumbing, but I couldn't. In the years since, I've talked myself into and out of what happened 100 times. Was it really a ghost, some kind of presence, or just an old house with bad plumbing and my overactive teenage imagination? But here's the thing, I know what I felt. That wasn't imagination. Those cold fingers on my neck were real. The way both faucet handles turned fully on was real. And whatever waited for me in that bathroom, wanting me to turn around and see it, that was real too. I've stayed in plenty of places since then, including some pretty old houses. I've experienced faulty plumbing and drafty hallways. None of them ever made me feel what I felt in that hallway in Sequim. I'm an adult now with a degree in engineering. I understand how water pressure works, how pipes can knock and groan, how old houses settle and create cold spots. None of that explains what happened to me. To this day, whenever I use a bathroom sink, I double-check that the faucets are completely off. And I never ever look back when walking down a dark hallway alone. I don't know what would have happened if I had turned around that night. Part of me is grateful I'll never know. But another part wonders if that's why I still think about it, because there's no explanation, no resolution, just the memory of cold fingers on my neck and the absolute certainty that something was there with me in that hallway, something that wanted to be seen. Story 13. I still remember the exact moment we pulled up to that house in Elderwood. It was supposed to be our fresh start, a newly constructed home where Daniel, our daughter Emma, and I could build our life together. The paint still smelled fresh, the fixtures gleamed, and everything had that perfect, untouched quality. I remember smiling at Daniel as he carried Emma up the front steps, thinking, this is it. This is our forever home. God, how wrong I was. The first few weeks were fine, exhausting with all the unpacking and settling in, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then I started noticing something. It's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It wasn't like some dramatic horror movie with slamming doors or ghostly apparitions. It was subtle, insidious. It started when I'd be sitting on the couch in the living room, usually after putting Emma down for the night. Daniel works late shifts at the hospital, so I'd often be alone downstairs, scrolling through my phone or watching TV. That's when I first felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you and you just know it? Like that, except I'd look up and find nothing but empty space. At first, I brushed it off. New house, unfamiliar sounds, overactive imagination, all the logical explanations. But it kept happening, and instead of getting used to the house, I found myself becoming increasingly on edge. The worst part was what happened when I'd nap on that couch. I've always been someone who could nap anywhere, anytime. But in that house, I'd wake up absolutely drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd run a marathon, filled with this overwhelming sense of danger. Not the remnants of a nightmare. I wasn't dreaming anything I could remember, just pure primal anxiety. After the third time it happened, I stopped napping downstairs altogether. Nights became a problem too. The darkness in that house wasn't normal. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. Darkness should be passive, just the absence of light, right? But in that house, especially in our bedroom, it felt heavy, oppressive, almost like it had substance, like it was actively pushing against the light. Within 2 months, we were sleeping with the lights on, all of them. Daniel complained about the electricity bill, but even he couldn't deny that something felt off. He'd never admit it was anything supernatural. He's a man of science through and through, but he'd flinch sometimes at nothing, or stare a little too long at empty corners. Emma was only 3 at the time, but kids that age are perceptive in ways adults aren't. She started refusing to play in certain parts of the house, particularly the hallway outside our bedroom. When I'd ask her why, she'd just say, "The dark lady doesn't like me there." We didn't have any pictures of women with dark hair or clothing in that hallway. Nothing that could explain what she was seeing. By the 3rd month, I was spending as much time as possible out of the house. I'd take Emma to my mom's place or to the park, basically anywhere that wasn't home. Daniel thought I was overreacting, but he wasn't there during the day. He didn't feel what I felt. Then came that night, the night that still makes me question everything I believe about reality. It was a Tuesday in October. Daniel was working overnight, and Emma was sleeping at my mother's because I had a deadline for work the next morning. I remember thinking it was a blessing in disguise. Having the house to myself meant I could focus without distractions. I worked until around midnight, then took a shower and got ready for bed. Our bedroom had a small TV mounted on the wall opposite the bed, nothing fancy, just a simple flat screen with a Roku. I usually watched something mindless to help me fall asleep, especially when I was alone in the house. I remember checking all the locks twice, leaving the hallway light on, and getting into bed. I put on some cooking competition show, something comforting and non-threatening, set the sleep timer for 30 minutes, and drifted off. I woke up at exactly 2:47 a.m. I know because I checked my phone immediately after what happened. The TV was on, but it wasn't playing the cooking show anymore. It was just on the Roku home screen glowing in the darkness. My first thought was that the sleep timer hadn't worked, or maybe I'd hit the wrong button on the remote. I wasn't particularly alarmed, just annoyed at the light and noise disrupting my sleep. I figured the remote was somewhere in the bed, maybe under a pillow where I'd accidentally pressed a button. I found the remote sitting on my nightstand. I distinctly remember thinking that was weird because I usually kept it on the bed with me, but I was exhausted and not thinking clearly, so I just grabbed it, pointed it at the TV, and turned it off. I put the remote back on the nightstand, rolled over, and closed my eyes. Not even 30 seconds later, I heard the distinctive click of the TV turning back on. Now I was annoyed. I sat up and looked at the TV, which was displaying the Roku home screen again. I figured the power button must be stuck or something, so I picked up the remote, turned the TV off again, and this time I popped the back off the remote and took out the batteries. Problem solved, right? I put the gutted remote and batteries back on the nightstand, pulled the covers up, and closed my eyes again. Click. My eyes shot open. The TV was back on, but this time it wasn't showing the Roku home screen. It was just white, completely white. Like someone had tuned it to a non-existent channel. No static, no snow, just a flat, bright white screen casting an unnatural glow across the bedroom. I sat up fully, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no logical explanation for this. The remote had no batteries, even if it did. A remote doesn't make a TV display a white screen like that. I felt it then. That same feeling of being watched, but intensified 100-fold. The air in the room felt thick, charged, like right before a lightning storm. The white light from the TV didn't illuminate the room the way it should have. Instead of dispersing, it seemed contained, almost like it was being held back by the darkness around it. "Absolutely not," I said out loud, my voice sounding strange and small in the heavy air. "Knock it off. Right now." I don't know why I said that. I don't know who or what I was talking to. It just came out. Like some primal part of my brain knew there was something there to address. Nothing happened. The TV stayed on, that unnatural white glow continuing to battle with the darkness of the room. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, my hands shaking as I threw back the covers. I crossed the room in 3 steps, reached behind the TV and yanked the power cord out of the wall socket with enough force that I nearly pulled the TV off its mount. The screen went black instantly. For a moment, I just stood there, power cord in hand, trying to catch my breath. The logical part of my brain was already making excuses. Power surge, faulty wiring in the new house, a weird technical glitch with the Roku. But I knew something in that house had just communicated with me. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed, every light in the house turned on, clutching my phone and jumping at every creak and settle of the house. I didn't call Daniel. What would I say? The TV turned itself on, and I think our house is haunted. He'd think I was having a breakdown. When the sun finally came up, I packed a bag, picked up Emma from my mom's, and told Daniel we were staying at a hotel for a few days because of a water issue in the bathroom. He was too busy with his hospital rotation to question it much. During those hotel days, I started looking for another place to live. I found a rental on the other side of Elderwood, smaller, older, not nearly as nice as our new build, but crucially, not our house. It took some convincing, but eventually I got Daniel to agree to move. I framed it around Emma's preschool being closer to the new place, the shorter commute for him, anything but the truth. He thought I was being impulsive and irrational, but he went along with it because he could see how desperate I was. We moved out exactly 4 weeks after the TV incident. I left that television behind, telling Daniel it had electrical issues and wasn't worth moving. He bought a new one for the rental house. I've never told him the real reason. It's been 12 years since that night, and I've never experienced anything like it again. We eventually bought another house in a completely different town, and it's been perfectly normal. No oppressive darkness, no feeling of being watched, no inexplicable electronics issues. But I still think about that house in Elderwood. I've looked up its history since then. Turns out it wasn't just newly constructed. It was built on land that had been vacant for decades because the previous structure burned down in the 1970s. 3 people died in that fire. I don't know if that's relevant, but it feels like it might be. I don't know what was in that house with us. I don't know if it was some kind of electrical anomaly that affected both the house and my perception, or if it was something else, something that used that TV as an unintentional portal. All I know is that I've never been able to sleep in complete darkness since then. And sometimes when I'm alone and it's very quiet, I still check the corners of rooms just to make sure nothing's watching me from the shadows. Story 14. I've never told anyone this story because, honestly, who would believe me? But I can't keep it bottled up anymore. 3 months ago, I decided to take a break from my life. Work had been stressful, my relationship was falling apart, and I just needed some time to clear my head. My uncle has this hunting cabin several hours outside of Ridgefield, buried deep in the woods where there's no cell service, no internet, nothing but trees, wildlife, and silence. He offered me the keys and I jumped at the chance for some solitude. The drive out there took forever. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, then to what was basically just 2 dirt tracks cutting through dense forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. The cabin itself was exactly what you'd expect. A small, one-room structure with wooden paneling that had seen better days, a squeaky twin bed pushed against one wall, and an old cast-iron wood stove for heat. There was a tiny bathroom addition off the back with a shower that only ran cold water, and a small kitchenette area with a propane stove and a mini fridge that hummed loudly. Nothing fancy, but it was clean enough and had everything I needed. The first day passed without incident. I spent most of it unpacking, chopping some extra firewood, and exploring the immediate area around the cabin. There's a small creek about 50 yards behind the property where my uncle told me he sometimes fishes. I'm not much of an outdoorsman, but the setting was beautiful, peaceful in a way that made me realize how much noise fills my regular life. That first night was strange, though not necessarily frightening. I'm used to city noises, cars, neighbors, the occasional siren. Out there, the silence was almost deafening. I built a fire in the wood stove and read for a while by lantern light before turning in around 10. I remember waking up around 2 in the morning, hearing what sounded like footsteps on the wooden porch outside. At first it freaked me out, but I rationalized it as probably just a raccoon or maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin. I eventually fell back asleep. The second day and night were similar. I hiked a bit further from the cabin, found a nice spot to sit and read by the creek, and generally enjoyed the solitude. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but they seemed more deliberate somehow, a distinct pause between each step as if whatever was out there was listening for movement inside. Still, I told myself it was just wildlife and managed to fall back asleep. The third day is when things started to feel wrong. I spent most of the day like the others, reading, hiking, enjoying nature. But as the sun began to set, I felt this inexplicable heaviness settle over the cabin. It wasn't just the normal evening chill that had me adding extra logs to the fire. It was something else, like the air itself had become thicker, more resistant. Breathing felt like more effort than it should have. I tried to shake it off. I made a simple dinner, washed up, and settled into bed earlier than usual, around 9. I remember checking my watch and thinking how strange it was that time seemed to move so differently out there. Minutes felt like hours sometimes. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was in that strange state between sleeping and waking. My eyes were open. I could see the glow from the dying fire in the wood stove, casting weak orange light across the cabin's interior. But I couldn't move, not a finger, not a toe. My chest felt compressed, like someone was sitting on it. I knew immediately what was happening. Sleep paralysis. I'd experienced it once before in college during finals week when I was severely sleep deprived. This felt different though, more intentional. As I lay there, unable to even call out, I noticed the shadows near the wood stove. They weren't behaving as shadows should. The fire's light was steady, barely flickering at that point as it died down, but the shadows were moving independently, stretching, contracting, almost pulsing, and they seemed darker than they should have been, as if they were absorbing all available light rather than simply blocking it. Then came the whispers. At first they were so faint I thought I was imagining them, that hushed sound like when you can hear people talking in another room but can't make out the words. But gradually they became more distinct, still not full sentences but fragments, phrases, words that made my blood run cold. Left the garage door open again. Lied to Sarah about working late. Still thinks about Melissa sometimes. These were things about me, private things, mistakes I'd made, thoughts I'd had that no one else could possibly know. And the voices weren't mine. They weren't even all the same voice. It was like multiple people were having a conversation about me, passing my secrets back and forth, amused by my failures. I tried desperately to move, to break free from whatever had hold of me. I focused all my energy on just wiggling my fingers, my toes, anything. The whispering grew more frantic, more excited as I struggled. The shadows by the stove seemed to grow, extending tendrils across the floor towards my bed. I don't know how long this went on. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I managed to move my pinky finger, just slightly. That small victory gave me hope, and I focused harder. Gradually, I could wiggle all my fingers, then my toes. The paralysis began to release its grip. When I finally snapped upright in bed, gasping for breath like I'd been underwater, the shadows by the stove seemed to dissolve, not retreat, not fade, but dissolve, like ink dropping into water. The whispers stopped instantly, but what came next was worse. Laughter. Low, soft chuckling that seemed to come from all corners of the room at once. It wasn't menacing exactly, more like someone laughing at a private joke, like whatever had just happened was amusing to something. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, or my imagination, or some animal outside, but it felt directly aimed at me, as if whatever had trapped me in that paralysis was entertained by my struggle to break free. I scrambled to light the kerosene lantern by my bed with shaking hands. When the flame caught, I turned it up as high as it would go and placed it on the small table beside me. I didn't care about conserving fuel anymore. There was no way I was sitting in darkness again. Even with the lantern lit, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, back pressed against the cabin wall, eyes scanning the room constantly. The lantern flame flickered occasionally, as if someone was gently blowing on it, even though there was no draft I could feel. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. Daylight made everything seem more normal, more rational. I tried to convince myself it had just been an extreme episode of sleep paralysis combined with an overactive imagination, but then I stepped outside to use the outhouse and saw them, boot prints in the soft dirt by the porch steps. They weren't mine. I wear size 10 hiking boots with a distinctive tread pattern. These were larger, maybe size 13, with a different sole pattern entirely. And they were fresh, pressed into soil that had been softened by a light rain the previous evening. I hadn't been outside since before that rain. I hadn't heard a vehicle approach. The cabin is locked with a padlock on the outside, and I had the only key with me. No one else was supposed to be there, and the cabin is miles from any other building or residence. I packed my things immediately. I wasn't planning to leave until the end of the week, but whatever had happened that night was enough for me. I did a final sweep of the cabin to make sure I hadn't left anything behind, and that's when I noticed something on the small wooden table by the kitchenette. My journal was open. I always keep a leather-bound journal with me, but I'm certain I closed it and put it in my backpack the night before. Now it sat open on the table and written across the bottom of a page in my own handwriting, but not written by me, were the words, "I'll be waiting when you come back." I grabbed the journal, threw it in my bag with my remaining belongings, and got out of there. The drive back to civilization felt like it took twice as long as the drive in, and I kept checking my rearview mirror the entire time, half expecting to see something following me. It's been 3 months, and I still don't know what to make of what happened. I've tried researching sleep paralysis, local legends around those woods, anything that might explain what I experienced. Nothing quite fits. My uncle asked last week when I planned to return the cabin keys, hinting that I might want to use the place again sometime. The rational part of me says I should never go back. Whatever was in that cabin, whether supernatural or just my mind playing tricks, it wasn't good. But here's the strangest part. Despite my fear, I feel drawn to return. It's like an itch I can't scratch, a question that needs answering. Sometimes I catch myself looking at those keys, thinking about the drive out there, wondering if it would happen again or if I'd find some explanation. It's as if whatever was there is patient, confident that my curiosity will eventually overcome my fear. And the most disturbing thing is, it might be right, because even as I write this, I'm not sure I can stay away forever. Something is waiting for me in those woods, and part of me feels like our encounter isn't over. But if I do go back, I won't be going alone, and I won't be staying after dark. Story 15. I still get goosebumps every time I think about what happened that night at my cousin Jake's cabin. It was around 5 years ago, late October in northern Minnesota. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, you know? Jake had been pestering us to visit his new place for months, bragging about the fishing and how it was the perfect spot to disconnect from all the bullshit, as he put it. My brother Mike and I finally caved. We both managed to get the same weekend off work and drove up there on a Friday night. Big mistake. The drive took way longer than expected. Google Maps had us turning onto these unmarked dirt roads that seemed to get narrower with every mile. No streetlights, just our headlights cutting through pitch darkness and tall pines on both sides. We didn't reach the cabin until almost 11 at night. It was one of those classic Minnesota lake cabins. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a small dock stretching into the water. There was a soft yellow light coming from inside, which meant Jake was still up waiting for us. I pulled the truck up close to the front porch, and Mike was out the door before I'd even put it in park. I don't blame him. After a 4-hour drive, I was desperate to stretch my legs too, but my aux cord had somehow gotten tangled around the gear shift, and I was fumbling to unhook it. "I'll be right there," I called after Mike, who was already grabbing his bag from the back. Jake must have heard us pull up because the front door swung open, and there was my cousin, beer in hand, grinning like an idiot. "About damn time," he shouted as Mike bounded up the steps. They disappeared inside while I was still fighting with the stupid cord. That's when I saw it. From where I was sitting in the truck, I had a clear view through the large living room window. The lights inside cast that warm yellow glow I mentioned, making it easy to see everything. Jake was showing Mike around, gesturing toward what I assumed was the kitchen, but there was someone else in there with them, a third person. This figure was tall, taller than both Jake and Mike, who aren't short guys. It was standing completely still in the corner of the living room, near what looked like a doorway to another room. I remember thinking it must be one of Jake's buddies. He'd mentioned something about neighbors possibly dropping by for drinks. What struck me as odd was how motionless this person was. While Jake and Mike moved around talking animatedly, I could see their mouths moving through the window. This third person just stood there. I couldn't make out their features clearly, just their silhouette, tall and lean. Finally freeing the aux cord, I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed the porch. When I pushed open the door, the warm air inside hit me like a wave. "There he is," Jake exclaimed, coming over to give me one of those half-hug, half-shoulder slaps guys do. "Thought you fell asleep out there." "Nah, just wrestling with technology," I said, my eyes already scanning the room. But there were only the three of us there, Jake, Mike, and me. I looked over to the corner where I'd seen the figure standing. There was nothing there. No furniture that I could have mistaken for a person, just an empty space near the doorway leading to what I later learned was a hallway to the bedrooms. "You all right?" Jake asked, noticing my confused expression. "Yeah, just tired from the drive," I lied, accepting the beer he offered. "Nice place you got here." For the next hour, we caught up, drank beer, and Jake gave us the full tour of his modest but cozy cabin. 2 small bedrooms, 1 bathroom, the main living area with a kitchenette and a screened porch overlooking the lake. The whole time I kept glancing back at that corner, half expecting to see someone standing there again. Eventually, after my 3rd beer, I casually asked, "So, is anyone else coming over tonight?" Jake looked puzzled. "No, just us. Why?" "I thought you mentioned neighbors might drop by?" "Oh, that," he chuckled. "I said that might happen tomorrow night. The couple down the shore sometimes comes over on Saturdays. Cool people. He's a retired dentist, makes his own beer." I nodded, trying not to look as unsettled as I felt. I could have sworn I saw someone else in here when we first arrived. Mike snorted. "You've been working too many night shifts, bro. It's messing with your head." I let it drop after that. We stayed up until around 2 in the morning, drinking and reminiscing about childhood summers spent at our grandparents' cabin, similar to this one but long since sold. The whole time, I kept feeling a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. When we finally turned in for the night, Jake took the main bedroom, while Mike and I were supposed to share the guest room with its twin beds. As we were getting ready, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. "Hey, Mike," I whispered, not wanting Jake to hear from his room. "I'm serious. When I was in the truck, I saw someone else in here with you guys." Mike looked at me with tired eyes. "Dude, there was nobody else here. Maybe it was a reflection in the window or something." "It wasn't a reflection," I insisted. "I saw it inside the cabin, standing near that doorway to the hall. It was tall, taller than you or Jake." "Well, it wasn't me or Jake wearing stilts," he said sarcastically. "Go to sleep. You're creeping me out." I tried to follow his advice, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old cabin kept me alert. Around 4 in the morning, I needed to use the bathroom. The hallway was pitch black, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. As I walked past the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. That feeling of being watched intensified. The living room was bathed in the blue glow of moonlight coming through the windows, and for a split second, I thought I saw that same tall figure standing in the corner again. But when I frantically shone my phone light in that direction, there was nothing there. After using the bathroom, I rushed back to the bedroom and finally fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and on edge. "You look like crap," Jake commented as he flipped pancakes on the stove. "Didn't sleep well," I mumbled, pouring myself a cup of coffee. We spent the day fishing on the lake, which was beautiful but yielded no catches. As the sun started to set, we headed back to the cabin. I was dreading nightfall, though I couldn't exactly explain why. That evening, Jake's neighbors did come by. Tom and Linda, the retired dentist, and his wife. They brought homemade beer and shared stories about living on the lake year-round. They seemed like perfectly normal, friendly people. At one point, when Jake and Mike were engrossed in a conversation about fishing lures, I quietly asked Linda how long she and Tom had lived nearby. "Oh, about 7 years now," she said. "We bought our place shortly after the incident with the previous owners of this cabin." My skin prickled. "Incident?" Linda lowered her voice. "I shouldn't gossip. Tom hates when I bring it up." "Please," I urged. "I'm just curious about the history." She glanced at Tom, who was busy explaining the brewing process to my brother. "Well, the family who owned this cabin before, they left quite suddenly. There was a teenage son who drowned in the lake. Tragic thing. They said he was tall for his age, nearly 6'4" at only 16. I felt the blood drain from my face. Did they find him?" "Oh yes, they recovered his body after 3 days. The family never came back after that. Just put the place up for sale. Your cousin got it for a steal." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I kept thinking about what Linda had told me, about what I'd seen that first night. When our guests left around 11, I helped clean up while fighting the urge to tell Jake and Mike everything. But what would I say? That I thought I'd seen the ghost of a drowned teenager. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mike's steady breathing from the other bed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, slow steps that didn't sound like Jake's. I froze, my entire body tense under the blankets. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open a few inches. From my bed, I could see only darkness through that gap. But I felt something there, watching. After what seemed like an eternity, the door slowly closed again, and the footsteps continued down the hall, toward the living room. I was too terrified to move, to check, to wake Mike. I just lay there, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would wake everyone in a 5-mile radius. The next morning, I made up an excuse about an emergency at work. We left hours earlier than planned. Despite Jake's protests, I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. On the drive home, Mike kept asking what was really going on with me. I finally broke down and told him everything. What I'd seen that first night, what Linda had told me, the footsteps, the door opening. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time before speaking. "You know what's weird? I woke up last night and saw you standing in the doorway. I thought you were going to the bathroom, but you were just standing there. I called your name, but you didn't answer." "Mike, I never got out of bed after we turned in," I said, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "We haven't been back to Jake's cabin since that weekend. He still invites us every few months, but we always have excuses. I've never told him what I saw or what Linda said about the previous owners. What would be the point? I still can't explain who or what was standing in that room before I entered. It wasn't a reflection, It was inside the cabin. It wasn't furniture or shadows playing tricks. It was someone standing there, watching my brother and cousin, watching me. And sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I get that same feeling of being watched. And I wonder if whatever was in that cabin followed me home. Story 16. I never told anyone the full story of what happened to me when I was 8. It's been almost 20 years, but I still get chills thinking about that house in Westbrook Hills. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but too many things happened that I can't explain away. We moved to Northern California in the summer of 2003 when Dad got transferred. Mom fell in love with this old Victorian in Westbrook Hills, a quiet suburb with perfect lawns and friendly neighbors. The house had character, she said. If only she knew what kind of character it really had. From the first night, something felt off. My bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway with this huge bay window overlooking the backyard. It should have been perfect for a little girl, but I hated it instantly. The air always felt heavy, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I started seeing things about a week after we moved in, just shadows at first, darting in the corners of my eyes. When I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing there. I tried telling my parents, but Dad said old houses make weird shadows, and Mom thought I was just adjusting to the new place. But it wasn't just shadows. Sometimes I'd be playing with my toys and feel someone watching me. I'd look up expecting to see my brother Tyler in the doorway, but no one would be there. Yet the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It got so bad that I started keeping my back to the wall whenever I played in my room. The dreams started about a month after we moved in. I'd wake up at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, not 2:59 or 3:01, exactly 3, every single time. I'd wake up and feel completely alert, like someone had called my name. Then I'd fall back asleep and have the same dream. I'd be standing at the edge of this beautiful meadow filled with wildflowers. In the center was a girl about my age, with long, light blonde hair, wearing a white nightgown. She never faced me, but she'd motion with her hand for me to follow her. Each night in the dream, I'd get a little closer to her. She'd lead me through the meadow, always staying just far enough ahead that I couldn't catch up. I never felt scared in the dreams, just curious. Who was this girl? What did she want to show me? My 9th birthday came in October. My parents got me this fancy bed with a bookshelf headboard. I was so excited. I loved reading and had tons of heavy hardcover books. I arranged all my favorites on the shelf above where my head would rest when I slept. Things escalated after my birthday. I started hearing whispers when I was alone in my room. Not clear words, more like hushed conversations just below the threshold of hearing. I'd turn off my music or TV to listen better, and they'd stop, only to start again once I'd convinced myself I was imagining things. One afternoon, I was doing homework at my desk when my pencil case flew off the table. Not fell, flew. Like someone had swiped it across the room. There was no window open, no fan running, nothing that could explain it. That night, I was so scared I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like whatever it was had moved from the corners of the room right to my bedside. I pulled my blanket over my head, but couldn't shake the sensation of eyes boring into me. I built this little fort around my head with pillows, partly for comfort, partly because I was terrified of what might be staring at me in the dark. I must have eventually fallen asleep because the dream came again. The meadow girl was there as always, but this time after I'd followed her deeper than ever before, she stopped walking. My heart pounded as she slowly turned around, but where her face should have been, there was just nothing. Smooth, blank skin, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just emptiness. I woke up screaming. It was 3:01 a.m. according to my digital clock. As I caught my breath, I heard a scraping sound above me. All the heavy books on my headboard shelf were sliding forward, moving on their own toward the edge, right where my head would have been if not for the pillow fort I'd built. I scrambled out of bed and ran to my parents' room. Dad checked the shelves and said they must be uneven, that the house was old and things settled. But I knew better. Those books had been stable for weeks, and they moved exactly when I woke from seeing the faceless girl. My mom started to look worried after that, not about the house, about me. She scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist, thinking I might be having trouble adjusting or acting out for attention. I overheard her telling my dad that kids sometimes invent scary stories when they're stressed. They had no idea how real it was. The worst night was when my friend Olivia slept over. We'd been at the same school before the move, and her parents let her visit for the weekend. I was so happy to have her there. I thought maybe whatever was in the house would leave me alone if I wasn't by myself. We stayed up late watching movies in the living room, then went up to my room around 11. I didn't tell Olivia about the weird stuff. I didn't want her to think I was crazy. We set up her sleeping bag on the floor beside my bed and eventually fell asleep. I woke up to screaming. Not the startled kind when someone has a regular nightmare. This was pure terror. Olivia was thrashing around in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide open but not seeing anything in the room. She was staring at something none of us could see, screaming, "No face! No face! She has no face!" My mom came running in and switched on the light. Dad followed right behind her. Mom grabbed Olivia by the shoulders and tried to wake her up, calling her name over and over. When Olivia finally snapped out of it, she looked confused and terrified. She was shaking and crying, but the weirdest thing was she couldn't remember what she'd been dreaming about. She had no memory of screaming about someone with no face. How could Olivia have the same dream I'd been having? I never told her, never told anyone. Olivia went home early the next morning. Her mom came to pick her up, and I overheard her telling my parents that Olivia had never sleepwalked or had night terrors before. My mom looked at me strangely after that, like she was starting to wonder if maybe I wasn't making things up after all. The following weekend, my parents went to dinner at a neighbor's house 2 doors down. They left Tyler in charge. He was 14 and thought he was so cool getting to babysit me. We were watching TV in the living room, some stupid cartoon he'd picked. I was sitting on the floor while he sprawled across the couch. The living room had this huge painting of a landscape above the fireplace. It had been there when we moved in, and Mom liked it so much she kept it. It showed a meadow with mountains in the background, not unlike the one from my dreams. We were just sitting there when suddenly, without warning, the painting crashed to the floor. The glass shattered everywhere. Tyler jumped up, swearing, which he wasn't supposed to do around me. The weird thing was, the nail it hung on was still in the wall, completely intact. The wire on the back of the painting hadn't broken either. It was like someone had lifted it off the wall and thrown it down. Tyler cleaned up the glass while I sat frozen on the couch. He told me not to tell Mom and Dad because he didn't want to get in trouble, thinking they'd blame him somehow. But I knew it was the house, or whatever lived in it, sending me a message. That night, I slept with all my lights on. I pushed my dresser in front of my door and wedged my desk chair under the doorknob. I was terrified that whatever had been visiting me in dreams was getting stronger, finding ways to affect the real world. The books sliding, Olivia's nightmare, the painting falling. It was escalating. I didn't have the dream that night, or the night after. For almost a week, nothing happened. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe whatever it was had gone away. Maybe I had imagined it all. Then came the night that still haunts me. I woke up at 3 a.m. exactly. The room was freezing cold, my breath visible in the air despite it being May in California. My nightlight was on, casting a dim glow across the room. And there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a girl with long blonde hair wearing a white nightgown. She was facing away from me, just like in the dreams. My entire body went rigid with fear. This wasn't a dream. She was in my room. Slowly, she started to turn around. I squeezed my eyes shut, remembering the blank face from my nightmare. I couldn't bear to see it in real life. I counted to 10 under my breath, then 20, then 50. When I finally got the courage to open my eyes again, she was gone. But on my bedroom wall, visible in the nightlight's glow, was a child's handprint. Too small to be mine, pressed into the wallpaper like someone with wet hands had touched it, and beneath it, scratched into the wall itself, were two words: "Help me." We moved out 2 weeks later. I never told my parents exactly what happened that night. I just refused to sleep in that room anymore, camping out in the hallway or sneaking into Tyler's room after everyone was asleep. Mom and Dad fought about it. Dad thought I was being difficult. Mom started to think maybe something was really wrong with the house. When the opportunity came for Dad to transfer again, Mom pushed for it harder than anyone expected. To this day, I've researched that house, trying to find out if a little girl died there. I've found nothing concrete, just rumors about the original owners losing a daughter to illness in the early 1900s. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back, try to help whatever or whoever was reaching out to me, but mostly I just try to forget. I still wake up sometimes at exactly 3 a.m. heart pounding, feeling watched, and I never ever sleep with bookshelves above my head. Story 17. I still can't explain what happened that night 6 months ago. I live in Oak Ridge, a small rural town where pretty much everyone knows everyone. My grandmother's house is connected to ours through this weird layout. There's only about 15 feet separating the buildings, with a little garden area in between. We've lived in this arrangement since I was a kid, and it's always felt safe having her so close. That changed on a Tuesday night in January. I remember it was around 2:40 in the morning when I woke up to Duke, our German shepherd, growling. Not just his usual, "there's a squirrel outside" growl, but something deeply unsettling, low, sustained, and with a tension I'd never heard from him before. Duke is normally super chill. He barely even barks when the delivery guy comes. This was different. The growling was so intense and persistent that it woke my dad up too. I heard his bedroom door open just as I was getting out of bed. We met in the hallway, both of us confused and a little freaked out. "You hear that?" he whispered. Duke was still growling, but now he was pacing between the back door and my bedroom window, the one that faces Grandma's house. "Something's wrong," I said. "My bedroom is in this weird spot that kind of connects the two houses. If anything happens at Grandma's place, I'm usually the first to know. She was visiting my aunt in Portland that week, so the house should have been empty." Dad went to the window and peered out toward Grandma's place. "I don't see anything, but Duke's really upset about something." That's when we heard it. A soft thud from Grandma's house, followed by what sounded like something being dragged across the floor. My heart started racing. "Dad, I think someone's in Grandma's house." He nodded, his face tight with worry. "Stay here," he said, but I wasn't about to let him check it out alone. "I'm coming with you," I insisted, grabbing the metal baseball bat I keep under my bed. Dad looked like he wanted to argue, but just nodded instead. "Let me get the flashlight. I'm going to lock the gate first," he said. "Our properties have this connecting gate in the back that we usually leave unlocked since it's just us." Dad grabbed his phone and the big flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Duke was still growling, now standing by the back door, the fur on his neck standing straight up. We stepped outside, and immediately something felt wrong. The air was weirdly still, but also heavy somehow, like right before a big storm. It was freezing cold too, way colder than it should have been for January in Oregon. As we started walking across our yard toward Grandma's house, the security light above our back door began to flicker. Then the light on Grandma's porch started flickering too. Not in unison, it was more like they were responding to each other. On, off, probably just a power surge, Dad muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. I gripped the bat tighter, my palms sweating despite the cold. Duke had followed us out and was now walking ahead, still growling but moving forward cautiously, like he was torn between protecting us and running away. When we reached Grandma's back door, Dad tried the handle. It was unlocked, which was odd because I distinctly remembered locking it after watering her plants the day before. Dad was about to push the door open when he suddenly stopped and put his arm out to block me. "Wait," he whispered. The back porch light was still flickering, casting weird, jumping shadows across the yard. In those flashes of light and dark, I saw what Dad was looking at. Duke's doghouse, the one Grandma had set up for him in her yard for when he spent time with her, had its door hanging open. There was something dark smeared across the front of it. My stomach dropped. "Is that... Julia, call Duke over here. Right now," Dad said, his voice tight. I whistled for Duke, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Duke came running to us, tail between his legs. He pushed himself against my legs, whining softly, seemingly relieved to see us. Dad crouched down and examined Duke carefully, running his hands through his fur. "He's okay," he said, sounding relieved. Then he pointed to the doghouse. "That's not blood. I don't know what it is, but it's not blood." In the flickering light, I could see it better now. Some kind of dark, viscous substance that looked almost like oil, but thicker. It was dripping down the front of the doghouse and pooling on the ground. "Dad, what the hell is that?" I whispered. Before he could answer, we heard another thud from inside Grandma's house, followed by what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the kitchen floor. Dad straightened up. "Close the door and go back to our house. Take Duke with you." "What? No way! I'm not leaving you here," I protested. "Julia, listen to me. Go back to the house and lock the door. Call 911 if I'm not back in 5 minutes. The way he said it, so calm but with this undertone of absolute seriousness, scared me more than anything else that night. Dad's not the type to get spooked easily. He was an EMT for 15 years before becoming a nurse. He's seen some serious stuff. If he was this concerned, something was very wrong. "Dad? Now, Julia, please." I nodded reluctantly, tugging on Duke's collar. As I turned to go, the security lights stopped flickering and went completely dark. All of them. Ours, Grandma's, even the street light at the end of the driveway. The only light came from Dad's flashlight and the dim glow of our cell phones. I hurried back to our house with Duke, who seemed more than happy to get away from Grandma's place. Once inside, I locked the door and stood by the window, watching Dad's flashlight beam move through Grandma's kitchen windows. I kept my phone in hand, 911 pre-dialed and ready to call. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Just as I was about to hit call, I saw Dad's flashlight heading back toward our house. I unlocked the door before he could knock. "Did you find anything?" I asked as soon as he was inside. Dad shook his head, looking confused. "Nothing. I checked every room, closet, under the beds. There's nobody in there." "But we heard something," I insisted. "And what about that stuff on Duke's doghouse?" Dad ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what that was. It's gone now." "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "I mean it's not there anymore. When I came out of the house, I checked, and there's nothing on the doghouse. No marks, no substance, nothing." I stared at him. "That's impossible. We both saw it." Dad just shook his head again. "I don't know what to tell you, Jules. It's not there." We stayed up for another hour, both too wired to sleep. Duke had calmed down somewhat, but kept staring at the door, occasionally letting out a low whine. Eventually, Dad convinced me to try to get some sleep since I had class in the morning. "We'll figure it out tomorrow," he promised. Maybe it was just an animal that got in somehow. "I'll check the house again in daylight." I went back to my room but didn't sleep. Instead, I sat on my bed, listening. Around 4 in the morning, I started hearing noises again. Not thuds this time, but softer sounds. It sounded like stretching, like something elastic being pulled and released. Then came the sound of small objects being knocked over, the kind of noise a cat might make walking across a cluttered shelf, except we don't have a cat, and these sounds were coming from Grandma's house. My room, being in the connecting area between the houses, gave me a front row seat to whatever was happening. I thought about getting Dad again, but decided against it. He'd already checked the whole house and found nothing. What would be different this time? So I just sat there, frozen, listening to those soft, inexplicable noises. Sometimes they would stop for a few minutes and I'd start to think it was over. Then they'd begin again. Soft, stretching sounds, little taps and thuds, and occasionally what sounded like whispering, though I could never make out any words. Despite my fear, exhaustion eventually won out, and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my window and Dad was knocking on my door. "Jules, you awake? I made breakfast." I dragged myself to the kitchen, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Dad looked tired too, with dark circles under his eyes. "Did you hear anything else last night?" I asked, pouring myself some coffee. Dad hesitated before answering. I went back to check Grandma's house around 5:30. Still nothing inside. "But did you hear the noises, the stretching sounds?" He gave me a strange look. Stretching sounds. I described what I'd heard, the elastic stretching, the objects being knocked over, the whispers. Dad listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. "I didn't hear that," he finally said. But what?" He sighed. "I found something weird on the inside of Grandma's back door, some kind of marks, like scratches, but not from an animal. They're too uniform, too deliberate." My skin crawled. "Can I see them?" "I took pictures," he said, pulling out his phone. He showed me a series of photos of the back door, the inside part that faces Grandma's kitchen. There were 5 perfectly parallel lines etched into the wood, each about 8 inches long. They were deep enough to have gone through the paint and into the wood itself. "Those weren't there before," I said with absolute certainty. I'd been through that door hundreds of times, and there had never been any scratches on it. "I know," Dad replied. "I'm going to replace the door before Grandma gets back. No need to worry her." We spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but both of us kept glancing toward Grandma's house. Duke refused to go into the backyard at all, even when Dad tried to coax him out with treats. That night I moved to sleep on the couch in the living room, as far from the connecting wall as possible. Dad didn't object. Nothing happened that night or any night since. Grandma came back from Portland a few days later, and everything went back to normal, on the surface at least. Dad replaced the back door without telling her why, and we never found any explanation for the noises or the strange substance on Duke's doghouse. But things aren't really the same. Duke still won't go near Grandma's yard, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear those stretching sounds. Dad installed better security lights and cameras, but they've never caught anything unusual. I don't know what visited us that night. Maybe it was just an animal like Dad suggested, though that doesn't explain the marks on the door or the substance that disappeared. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that was drawn to an empty house and left when it realized it wasn't alone. All I know is that sometimes when I'm in my room late at night, I swear I can hear something moving on the other side of the wall, something that stretches and whispers and waits. Story 18. I've been putting off writing this for weeks now, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here can make sense of what happened, because I sure as hell can't. Last month, I got a call from my mom about Great Aunt Eliza. She's 90 years old and finally reached the point where she can't take care of herself anymore. Since I'm between jobs right now, got laid off from the construction company in January, I volunteered to help clean up her place before we move her to assisted living. Eliza's house is this massive Victorian place on the outskirts of Mapleton, Nebraska. Everyone in town calls it Pinewood Manor. It was built sometime in the 1920s, and it's the kind of place that looks like it belongs in a horror movie. All peeling paint, weathered wood, and those tall, narrow windows that seem to watch you. I'd only been there a handful of times as a kid, and I always hated it. The moment I pulled into the gravel driveway, that same feeling from childhood came rushing back. You know when the hair on your arms stands up for no reason? It was like that, but all over my body. I sat in my truck for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at the house and trying to talk myself into going inside. Mom had given me the key, saying Eliza was already staying with my Aunt Meredith until we could get her properly situated in a care facility. The key was old and brass, heavy in my palm as I approached the front door. It stuck in the lock, and I had to jiggle it before the mechanism finally gave with a loud click that echoed through the empty porch. The door swung open with a long, drawn-out creak. The smell hit me immediately. musty, like old books and dust with something else underneath, something sickly sweet that made my stomach turn. "Hello?" I called out, even though I knew nobody was home. My voice bounced off the walls and came back to me, making me feel even more alone. The foyer was dimly lit by what little sunlight filtered through the grimy windows. Family photos lined the walls, generations of stern-faced ancestors staring down at me with disapproving eyes. I never understood why old photos always look so creepy. Maybe it's because nobody smiled back then. I started in the kitchen, figuring I'd work my way through the house methodically. The kitchen wasn't too bad, just outdated appliances from the 70s and cabinets full of expired food. I spent about an hour there, filling garbage bags and wiping down surfaces. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. Nobody was ever there, of course, but the feeling persisted. By mid-afternoon, I'd made my way upstairs to the bedrooms. Great Aunt Eliza's room was exactly what you'd expect from a 90-year-old woman. Floral wallpaper, a four-poster bed with a faded quilt, and knickknacks everywhere. Nothing unusual. Then I found the closet. It wasn't obvious at first. The door blended perfectly with the wallpaper, with just a small brass handle giving it away. I figured it was just a linen closet or something. But when I pulled it open, I discovered it was actually a walk-in closet about the size of a small bathroom. The inside was wrong, somehow. While the rest of the house was dusty, but otherwise well-maintained, this closet felt different. The air was heavier in there, almost difficult to breathe. The temperature dropped noticeably as soon as I stepped inside. The closet was filled with shelves and drawers, most of which contained what you'd expect. Old clothes, winter blankets, shoeboxes full of receipts and documents. But as I started moving things around, I noticed something behind a stack of hat boxes. It was a painting. Not just any painting, but a detailed, almost photorealistic portrait of what could only be Lucifer. Not the cartoonish devil with horns and a pitchfork, but a beautiful, terrible angel with burning eyes and an expression of such malevolence that I physically recoiled. The detail was incredible. You could see every feather in his wings, which weren't white, but a gradient of ash gray to charcoal black. His face was inhumanly perfect except for the eyes, which seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. My first thought was, why the hell would Aunt Eliza have this? She was never particularly religious, but this wasn't the kind of art I'd expect from an elderly woman living alone in rural Nebraska. As I moved more items, I found more paintings hidden throughout the closet, each one more disturbing than the last. Demons torturing souls, angels with faces twisted in agony, rituals involving blood and fire, all painted with the same incredible detail and skill. The most disturbing part, the wall and floor around where these paintings had been stored was different. The wood was darker, almost black in places, and the paint had bubbled and peeled as if exposed to extreme heat. When I touched it, my fingers came away with a greasy residue that smelled faintly of sulfur. On the back wall of the closet, partially hidden behind a rack of moth-eaten coats, was a built-in cabinet with dozens of small drawers, like an old apothecary chest. Each drawer was labeled with neat handwriting, names of herbs and substances I mostly didn't recognize. Wormwood.nightshade, mandrake root. Some drawers contained small glass jars filled with powders or dried plants. But it was the large drawer at the bottom that made me run from the house the first time. It was about 8 inches high, 24 inches wide, and maybe 12 inches deep. When I pulled it open, I found it filled to the brim with human hair. Different colors, different textures, some in braids, some loose, some tied with ribbons. All of it looking like it had been collected over decades. I slammed the drawer shut and backed away so fast I knocked over a stack of boxes. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot, and I swear I heard something respond from downstairs, a thump like something heavy being dropped. I didn't stick around to investigate. I ran down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door, leaving it wide open behind me. I didn't even realize until I got home that I'd left the water running in the bathroom sink where I'd been filling a bucket to clean the floors. I called my mom that night, trying to sound casual, as I asked about Aunt Eliza's art collection. Mom had no idea what I was talking about. According to her, Eliza never had any interest in art beyond the typical landscape paintings you'd see in any grandma's house. I didn't mention the hair. I didn't want to go back alone the next day, so I convinced my mom to come with me. I also brought along my 1-year-old son, Jake. In retrospect, that was a terrible decision, but I didn't have anyone to watch him, and I figured with 3 of us there, the house wouldn't feel so oppressive. I was wrong. The second day was worse. The feeling of being watched had intensified, especially near the closet. Mom was downstairs sorting through china cabinets while I finished up in the bedrooms, Jake playing with some toys on a blanket I'd spread out in the hallway where I could see him. I was back in that closet, trying to document everything with my phone before we decided what to do with it all, when I heard it. Footsteps crossing the floor downstairs, heavy, deliberate steps that didn't belong to my mom. "Mom?" I called down. "You okay down there?" Her voice came back from the dining room, exactly where she was supposed to be. "Fine, honey. Just sorting through these dishes." The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the house to the other. I scooped up Jake and went downstairs, finding Mom exactly where she said she'd be, carefully wrapping teacups in newspaper. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She looked confused. "Hear what?" "Someone walking around upstairs." Mom laughed. "That was probably you, Marcus. Sound carries weird in these old houses." But I hadn't been walking. I'd been standing still, frozen in place, as I listened to someone, or something, moving through a house that should have contained only the 3 of us. We split up again after lunch. I was in the kitchen clearing out the pantry when Mom came in, white as a sheet and shaking. "I'm leaving," she said, grabbing her purse. "Now." "What happened?" I asked, alarmed by the look on her face. "There was a man," she said, voice trembling, "in the doorway of Eliza's sewing room, just standing there, watching me. When I looked up, he rushed at me, fast, like unnaturally fast, and then he was just gone." "What did he look like?" I asked, even as I was gathering up Jake's things. Mom shook her head. I couldn't see his face clearly, just a shape, a man's shape, but he felt angry, hostile. She was already heading for the door. "I'm not coming back here, Marcus. This place isn't right." That night, Jake woke up screaming at exactly 3 in the morning, not crying like a normal baby, but full-on screaming in terror, eyes wide open, but not seeming to see anything in the room. It took almost an hour to calm him down. He's always been an easy baby, sleeps through the night, rarely fusses, so this was completely out of character. The same thing happened the next night, and the next, always at exactly 3 a.m., like clockwork. My wife thought he might be having night terrors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the house. I talked to other family members who had been to Pinewood Manor over the years. Everyone had a story. Doors slamming by themselves, footsteps in empty hallways, the persistent feeling of being watched. My cousin swore she once saw a tall figure standing at the foot of her bed during a childhood sleepover at Aunt Eliza's, only for it to vanish when she screamed. No one had any explanation for the paintings or the drawer of hair. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Aunt Eliza directly during a visit to Meredith's house, she just smiled vaguely and said, "The angels spoke to me, dear. They told me to keep them safe." I haven't been back to the house since. We hired a professional cleaning service to finish the job, though I never told them what to expect in that closet. I wonder sometimes if they found it, or if somehow those paintings and that drawer full of hair disappeared before anyone else could see them. Jake still wakes up screaming sometimes, always at 3 a.m. The pediatrician says he'll grow out of it, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes, in the dark of his room as I try to comfort him, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't be there, watching us both with burning eyes that follow me no matter where I stand. Story 19. I've been going back and forth about whether to post this for months now. I'm not the type who believes in supernatural stuff. I'm pretty grounded, actually. But what happened to me during COVID lockdown in 2020 has messed me up in ways I'm still trying to process. I live in Westminster, Maryland. Not a huge town, but not tiny either. During the pandemic, I was working night shifts at an Amazon warehouse, one of the essential workers who couldn't just stay home. The pay was decent, and honestly, I needed the money badly after my roommate lost her job and moved back with her parents. This happened in late April 2020, when the pandemic was still new and scary, and nobody knew what the hell was going on. I remember it was a Thursday night, technically Friday morning, around 4 a.m. I had just finished my shift and was walking home. Usually, I would have driven, but my car was in the shop after some idiot sideswiped me in the parking lot earlier that week. The streets were completely empty, like post-apocalyptic empty. It was eerie how quiet everything was. No cars, no people, just the occasional porch light. The whole world felt off. That's the only way I can describe it, like we were living in some alternate reality where everything looked the same but felt wrong. I was on the phone with my friend Jess, who was also working nights. She lived across the country, so we'd talk during my walks home to keep each other company. We were just chatting about normal stuff, how weird the pandemic was, how people were hoarding toilet paper, the usual COVID talk. I remember telling her, "This town is so dead right now. It's like I'm in one of those zombie movies where I'm the last person alive." And literally seconds after I said that, I spotted someone jogging on the other side of the street, about a block ahead. At first, I was just surprised to see another human being out at that hour. But as they got closer, I noticed something odd. This person was dressed exactly like Richard Simmons. I'm not even joking. They had the puffy dark hair, a bright red headband, a tank top, those tiny striped shorts that barely covered anything, and long white socks pulled up. The whole deal. I actually laughed and said to Jess, "Oh my God, there's literally a guy dressed like Richard Simmons jogging down my street right now." She thought I was messing with her, but I wasn't. The guy was jogging in this really exaggerated way too, arms pumping way up, knees high, like he was performing rather than actually exercising. It looked almost like a parody. At the time, I just thought, well, the pandemic is making everyone lose their minds a little. People were doing all kinds of weird stuff to cope. My neighbor had started having full conversations with her plants, and another guy on my street would go outside at noon every day and howl like a wolf. So a Richard Simmons impersonator? Sure, why not? The street I was on was about to connect with an alley I usually cut through to get home faster. I saw the Richard Simmons guy cross over to my side of the street ahead of me, still doing his theatrical jog. He turned down the same alley I was headed toward. I hesitated for a second because following a strange man down an alley at 4 in the morning isn't exactly a smart move, but it was my normal route, and I figured he'd be far ahead of me anyway at the pace he was going. Should I be worried about following Richard Simmons down a dark alley? I joked to Jess. She told me to keep her on the phone just in case, which I was planning to do anyway. So I turned into the alley, and I could see the Richard Simmons guy about halfway down, still jogging with that same cartoonish motion. The alley was narrow but straight, so I could see him clearly under the occasional security lights mounted on the backs of buildings. Then something happened that I still can't explain. The Richard Simmons guy suddenly stopped. Not like he was tired or taking a break. It was like someone had hit a pause button. His body completely froze mid-jog with one foot in the air, but his head slowly turned toward me. Not like a normal person would turn to look at something. It was mechanical, deliberate, and it kept going way past where a neck should be able to turn. I stopped walking. Jess was saying something on the phone, but I couldn't process her words anymore. All I could focus on was this thing staring at me from about 50 feet away. "There's something wrong," I whispered into the phone. And then, God, I still get chills thinking about it. The Richard Simmons figure dropped to all fours. Not like a person would get down on their hands and knees. It was one fluid motion, unnaturally smooth, like its body wasn't made of bones, but something else entirely. Now it was crouched there, still in that ridiculous outfit, head still turned toward me at that impossible angle. For a second we just stayed like that, me frozen in terror, it watching me from all fours. Then it started moving toward me, not crawling like a human would crawl, it was scuttling, like its limbs could bend in ways they shouldn't. And it was fast, way too fast. I don't remember consciously deciding to run, my body just took over. I spun around and sprinted back out of the alley. I was still clutching my phone, and I could hear Jess yelling, asking what was happening. All I could get out between gasps was, "It's chasing me. Something's wrong with it. It's not right." I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was convinced that if I turned my head, it would be right behind me, and I'd feel those hands, or whatever they were, grabbing me. So I just ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but pure adrenaline kept me going. My house was only a few blocks away if I took the main streets instead of the alley. I ran those blocks like my life depended on it, because in that moment, I truly believed it did. I reached my front door, fumbled with my keys, and practically fell inside. I slammed the door shut, locked it, threw the deadbolt, and then collapsed on the floor, back against the door, gasping for breath. Jess was still on the phone, completely freaked out. "Melissa, what the hell is happening? Do you need me to call 911? Are you okay?" I couldn't answer right away. I was shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone. When I could finally speak, I told her what I'd seen, the Richard Simmons guy, how he'd moved, how he'd chased me. She thought someone was playing a sick joke on me. That made sense, right? Some asshole taking advantage of the empty streets during lockdown to scare the crap out of people. But it didn't explain how he moved. No human can move like that. After I calmed down a little, I got up and went to my kitchen window. From there, I could see part of the street I'd just run down. I half expected to see that figure standing there, staring at my house, but the street was completely empty, no sign of anyone, Richard Simmons or otherwise. I stayed on the phone with Jess for another hour, too terrified to hang up. Eventually, I convinced myself that I must have misinterpreted what I saw. Maybe it was just some weirdo trying to scare me. Maybe the pandemic stress was making me imagine things. Maybe the exhaustion from working nights was catching up to me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't human. I didn't go to work the next day. I called in sick and spent the whole day researching online, trying to make sense of what happened. That's when I stumbled across stories about skinwalkers, these shape-shifting creatures from Native American legends, the descriptions of their movements, how they can take human form but move wrong somehow. It matched what I saw. Some stories said they mimic humans but can't quite get it right, like they're wearing human forms like ill-fitting suits. The way that thing moved, the impossible angle of its head, the fluid drop to all fours. It was like it was trying to be human but couldn't maintain the act once it decided to chase me. Of course, I know how this sounds. Believe me, I do. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head, trying to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was just a person in a costume playing a cruel prank. Maybe they were on drugs and having some kind of episode. Maybe I was more sleep-deprived than I realized, and my mind filled in details that weren't really there. But none of those explanations feel right. None of them explain the wrongness of what I saw. I quit that job a week later, found something that let me work days instead. I moved to a different apartment on the other side of town a month after that. I told myself and everyone else it was because I found a better place, but the truth is I couldn't stand walking past that alley anymore. It's been over 3 years now and I've never seen anything like that again. Most days I can convince myself it was just a weird, traumatic thing that happened during an already surreal time in the world. But sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night, I remember the way its head turned toward me, and I know whatever I saw that night wasn't human. I still can't watch Richard Simmons videos. I used to think they were funny, but now they make my skin crawl. Something about the enthusiasm, the exaggerated movements. It reminds me too much of what I saw. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I wouldn't believe me either. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real. Whatever it was, skinwalker, demon, or just some sick human being who gets off on terrifying strangers, it was out there that night. wearing a Richard Simmons costume like it was trying to blend in but couldn't quite figure out how humans work. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else in Westminster has seen it, if it's still out there, jogging through empty streets at 4 a.m., waiting for someone else to walk down that alley. I hope not. I really, really hope not. Story 20. I've never shared this with anyone outside my closest friends. For most of my life, I've just tried to pretend it wasn't happening, but after what happened last week, I need to get this out. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I'm a medium. I've been communicating with the dead since I was about 7 years old. I'm 42 now. Being a medium isn't like in the movies. It's mostly subtle impressions, feelings, sometimes voices or images. I've built a modest career out of it, helping people find closure with loved ones who've passed on. I'm used to the strange and unexplainable, but there's one thing in my life that has terrified me more than any spirit or entity I've ever encountered. Since I was a little girl, I've been seeing the same man. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something else. He doesn't communicate, he doesn't approach me, he just watches. The first time I saw him, I was maybe 5 or 6. I was playing in our front yard when I noticed him standing across the street, a bald, older white man with the most peculiar body shape, like a pear, wide at the bottom and narrowing at the top. He had these thick, dark eyebrows that stood out against his pale skin and unusually thick eyelashes. His face was completely expressionless. He was wearing an old-fashioned brown suit, the kind you'd see in photos from the 40s or 50s. I remember feeling scared immediately. Not the normal, stranger danger kind of scared the kids feel. This was deep, primal terror. I ran inside and told my mom, but when we went back out, he was gone. I forgot about him for a while, until I was 9. I was at the grocery store with my dad, and there he was again, at the end of the aisle, just staring. Same expressionless face, same outdated clothes, same overwhelming feeling of dread that washed over me. I tugged on my dad's sleeve and pointed, but when my dad looked, the man turned and walked away. My dad thought I was making it up. Throughout my teenage years, the sightings continued. Maybe once or twice a year, I'd spot him at the mall, at school events. Once at a movie theater, always with the same blank stare, never aging, never changing, always wearing the same style of clothes. I started to think of him as the Watcher. The worst was when I was 17. I was waiting at the bus stop near my house and he just appeared. Not walked up, not approached. One moment I was alone, and the next he was standing right next to me. I could smell him, a weird, musty odor like old books, and something else I couldn't place. I was frozen with fear. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. That bottomless dread was so intense I thought I might pass out. We stood there for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then the bus came, and when I looked back after boarding, he was gone. I told my mum about it that night and she took me to a therapist. The therapist suggested it might be a hallucination brought on by stress, maybe even early signs of schizophrenia, but I knew better. My abilities as a medium had been developing by then, and I knew the difference between what was in my head and what was real. As I got older and developed my abilities more formally, I learned to deal with all sorts of energies and entities. I've encountered angry spirits, confused souls, even what some might call demons, but nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever given me the same feeling of pure, unadulterated dread as this man. The sightings continued into my adult years. I'd go months, sometimes even a year without seeing him, and I'd start to relax. Then he'd show up again, a glimpse through a crowd. Standing across the street from my apartment, once sitting 3 rows behind me on a train. What makes it so unsettling is that he never ages. I'm 42 now. That's almost 40 years of sightings, and he looks exactly the same as he did when I was a child. The same wrinkles, the same posture, the same clothes. If he were a normal person, he'd be ancient by now, or more likely dead. I've tried everything to understand what he is. I've consulted other mediums, psychics, paranormal researchers. I've tried protection spells, cleansings, you name it. Nothing helps. Nothing explains it. I've come to accept that he's just part of my life. a terrifying, unexplainable part that makes me constantly look over my shoulder and check faces in crowds. I've learned to live with the sightings, though I never get used to that feeling of dread. But last week, something happened that shook me to my core. I was visiting my friend Lisa, who lives about 120 miles away from me. We were having a relaxing evening. She was cooking dinner and I was half watching YouTube on her TV while playing a game on my phone. It was one of those YouTube rabbit holes where the autoplay just keeps going from video to video. I wasn't really paying attention until I glanced up and felt my blood turn to ice. There, scrolling by as a thumbnail for an upcoming video, was a line drawing. A simple black and white sketch. It was him, the watcher. There was no mistaking it. The pear-shaped body, the bald head, those distinctive thick eyebrows and eyelashes. The same blank expression I've been seeing my entire life. I dropped my phone and scrambled for the remote, trying to go back, but the thumbnail was already gone. I frantically checked the watch history on Lisa's account, but the video hadn't actually played yet. It was just in the upcoming queue, and now it was gone. Lisa came in from the kitchen and found me pale and shaking. I tried to explain, but how do you tell someone that the entity that's been stalking you your entire life just showed up in a YouTube thumbnail? I ended up making an excuse about feeling suddenly ill. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. It wasn't just that the drawing looked like him. It was identical, like someone had reached into my brain and extracted my exact memory of him. And it wasn't just a coincidence of a bald man in a suit. It captured his specific body shape, his specific facial features, even the way he stands with his arms hanging slightly away from his body. The next morning, I spent hours searching YouTube for anything resembling that thumbnail. I tried every search term I could think of. Bald man drawing, pear-shaped man sketch, 1940s man illustration. Nothing matched what I'd seen. I've been home for 6 days now, and I haven't seen him in person since before the YouTube incident. But something's different. The feeling of being watched is constant now. Before, I only felt it when I actually saw him. Now it's with me all the time, in the shower, in bed, even in my locked office during client readings. Last night I woke up at 3 in the morning with that familiar feeling of dread so intense I could barely move. I lay there in the dark, certain he was in my room watching me. I finally worked up the courage to turn on the light, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. In all my years as a medium, in all my encounters with the unexplainable, I've never experienced anything like this. He's not a ghost. Ghosts are tied to places, to people, to unfinished business. They don't follow you for decades without aging. They don't appear in random YouTube videos hundreds of miles from home. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one who can see him. Maybe he's always there, watching everyone, but only those with certain abilities can perceive him. Or maybe he's somehow fixated on me specifically, for reasons I'll never understand. The most terrifying thought, the one that keeps me up at night, is that maybe he's not watching me at all. Maybe he's waiting for something, and after almost 40 years, whatever he's waiting for might finally be happening. I check my locks twice now before bed. I've started drawing the curtains in every room. I've even considered moving, though I know it wouldn't help. Distance clearly doesn't matter to whatever he is. If anyone has experienced something similar or has any insight, please let me know. I've lived with this for so long, but after seeing him in that video, I'm more afraid than I've ever been. Whatever he is, ghost, demon, something else entirely, he's found a new way to reach me, and I have no idea what happens next. Story 21. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this out. Maybe it's because I can't sleep, or maybe it's because I need to put this down somewhere before I convince myself it never happened. It's been 3 weeks, and I still can't make sense of what I experienced that night. I live in a small, single-wide trailer off Highway 16, about 20 minutes outside of Greenville. Nothing special, just a cheap place I could afford on my warehouse salary. It's usually noisy with trucks rumbling by at all hours, but you get used to it. The constant background noise almost becomes comforting after a while. That particular Tuesday, I'd worked a 12-hour shift. My back was killing me from loading pallets all day. I remember it was just after 7 in the evening when I collapsed onto my old brown couch, the one I'd picked up secondhand when I moved in 3 years ago. I was exhausted, just wanting to zone out in front of the TV for a while before going to bed. I hadn't even turned the television on yet when I noticed something felt off. The highway noise was gone. Not quieter, not muffled, completely absent. This wasn't normal. Even at 3 in the morning, you can hear something out there. But this was complete silence, the kind that makes your ears strain to hear anything at all. At first, I thought maybe there was an accident that had shut down the highway or some kind of road work. I was about to get up and look out the window when I felt it, a low buzzing sensation inside my head. Not painful, but insistent, like when you've been near loud machinery all day and can still feel the vibration after it's turned off. The buzzing grew stronger as I focused on it. It wasn't coming from outside or from any appliance in the trailer. It was somehow both inside my head and all around me at once. I rubbed my temples, thinking maybe it was just exhaustion or the beginning of a migraine. That's when I noticed the haze. At first, I thought my vision was blurring from tiredness, but then I realized there was actually something in the air. These weird trails of what looked like white chalk dust floating up toward the corners of the ceiling. They weren't moving like smoke or dust normally would. They were drifting upward in slow, deliberate patterns, almost like they were being drawn. I sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. My heart started pounding against my ribs. Something was seriously wrong. I blinked hard a few times, hoping it would clear my vision, but the haze remained. "What the hell is happening?" I whispered to myself, and the sound of my own voice seemed muffled, like I was speaking underwater. Then the room began to change, not in a dramatic flash like in movies, but gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. It was like watching colors bleed into wet paper. The edges of things started to blur and shift. My TV stand, a cheap black particle board thing from Walmart, began to fade, its outline becoming transparent. Behind it, or through it, I could see stacks of lumber leaning against the wall. Not new lumber like you'd see at a hardware store, but old weathered boards with faded markings on them. They weren't there, and then suddenly they were, as if they'd been there all along, and I was just now noticing them. I gripped the couch cushions, digging my fingers into the fabric. The buzzing in my head intensified, becoming a steady electrical hum that seemed to vibrate through my skull. The carpet beneath my feet was next. One moment I was looking at the beige carpeting I've had since I moved in, and the next it was gone isn't the right word. It was like it was becoming transparent, and underneath was a cement floor. The weird thing was, the cement still had a pattern on it that resembled carpet, like a memory or impression of what should have been there. I stood up, panicking now. The buzzing became so loud I could barely think. My living room was disappearing, transforming into someplace else entirely. The walls were still there, but they looked different. Older, water-stained in places, with different colored paint showing through in patches. I started pacing, trying to ground myself. "This isn't real," I kept saying. "This isn't happening." But every time I blinked, more of my familiar living room had faded away, replaced by this other place that seemed abandoned and empty. My coffee table was gone now, and in its place was a workbench covered in dust and what looked like old tools. My television had disappeared completely, leaving behind a blank wall with faded rectangles where posters or pictures might have once hung. I remember frantically rubbing my hands together, feeling my own skin, then dropping to my knees and pressing my palms against what was now mostly cement floor with just hints of my carpet still visible. I needed to feel something real, something solid. That's when I discovered something really freaking strange. When I held my breath, the buzzing sound got louder, more intense, and when the buzzing intensified, the transformation of the room seemed to accelerate. I'd hold my breath without thinking about it, just a natural response to fear. and more of my reality would slip away. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deeply, hoping it would reverse whatever was happening. It didn't stop the transformation, but it seemed to slow it down slightly. By this point, I was in full-blown panic mode. I tried calling out for help, but my voice sounded wrong, distant and echoey, like I was shouting into a cave. I thought about running outside, but I was terrified of what I might find out there. What if the entire world had changed? What if there was nothing out there at all? The strangest sensation was feeling like I was in two places at once. I could still see faint outlines of my furniture, like ghosts or memories, but they were overlaid with this other place, this abandoned, empty space that had the same dimensions as my living room, but was clearly somewhere else entirely. The buzzing had become almost unbearable now, making it hard to think clearly. I stumbled to where my front door should have been, but instead of the cheap hollow core door with peeling white paint, there was a heavy metal door with a push bar like you'd see in a commercial building or warehouse. It had rust around the edges and a small square window at eye level, but the glass was clouded and I couldn't see through it. I reached out to touch the handle, then hesitated. Something told me that if I opened that door, I might never get back to my real home. That door didn't lead to my gravel driveway. It led somewhere else entirely. I backed away, my heart thundering in my chest. The air felt thicker now, almost difficult to breathe. The chalk-like trails had multiplied, filling the upper part of the room with their strange, silent patterns. They seemed to be forming some kind of design or symbol in the air, but every time I tried to focus on the overall pattern, my eyes couldn't quite make sense of it. Then I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. In the corner where my recliner should have been, there was now what looked like a large industrial machine covered with a tarp, but the tarp was moving slightly, rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like something underneath was breathing. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. Up and down, with perfect regularity. Whatever was under there, it knew I was watching. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. It was aware of me. The buzzing reached a fever pitch and I clamped my hands over my ears, though it did nothing to block the sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately wishing everything would go back to normal. And then, just like that, it did. One moment I was staring at this alien room with the breathing thing in the corner, and the next I was back in my familiar living room. My TV stand was there, my coffee table, my carpet. The highway noise had returned, cars and trucks rushing by outside. I could hear my refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The transition back was so abrupt, it left me dizzy. There was no fading or blending like before, just an instant shift from one reality to another. The buzzing was gone too, leaving behind a ringing in my ears that gradually faded. I stayed frozen in place for what must have been at least an hour, listening, waiting for the shift to happen again. I was afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too deeply in case it triggered whatever had just happened. Eventually, I worked up the courage to check the rest of the trailer. Everything was normal, nothing had changed. I didn't sleep that night, or much the next few nights either. I've been staying with my sister when I can, making excuses about plumbing problems in my trailer. I haven't told anyone what happened. How could I? They'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I am. It hasn't happened again, at least not completely. But sometimes, late at night when the highway is quieter, if I hold my breath just right, I can hear that buzzing beginning to rise. And occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of those chalk-like trails forming in the corners of the ceiling. Whatever happened that night, whatever I experienced, it wasn't a dream or hallucination. I felt it. I saw it. And somehow, I know that thin barrier between my living room and that other place is still there, still fragile. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened that metal door. Where would it have led me? And that thing in the corner, under the tarp, what was it? I'm not sure I want to know the answers, but I'm also not sure I have a choice. Because even though I'm writing this from my sister's spare bedroom, I know I'll have to go back to my trailer eventually. And I can't shake the feeling that when I do, whatever's on the other side will be waiting for me. Story 22. I never believed in the supernatural until about 3 years ago. I was 16 then, hanging out with my best friend Jake on a boring Sunday afternoon with absolutely nothing to do. We'd already played video games for hours, watched some stupid videos online, and were lying around my basement complaining about having another day of school tomorrow. That's when Jake got this brilliant idea to make a Ouija board. I'd heard about them, of course, everyone has, but I'd never actually used one. Jake said his older sister had done it at a sleepover once and swore they'd contacted something. I laughed it off, but Jake was persistent. "Come on, what else are we gonna do today?" "It'll be fun," he kept saying, until I finally gave in. I remembered hearing that if you use a Ouija board in your house, whatever spirit you contact might decide to stay there. Permanent roommate situation. No thanks, so I suggested we go to Westridge Park, about a mile from my neighborhood. It was usually empty on Sunday afternoons, since most families were having dinner or getting ready for the school week. Jake grabbed some cardboard from our recycling bin and a black Sharpie. He drew the letters of the alphabet in a semicircle, added the numbers 0 through 9 below, and wrote yes and no in the top corners. At the bottom he wrote goodbye. It looked pretty lame compared to the store-bought ones I'd seen in movies, but Jake insisted it would work just the same. For the planchette, we used the cap from my mom's face cream that she'd thrown away. It was perfect because it was small but heavy enough to slide easily. We biked to the park around 4 in the afternoon. The sky was getting cloudy and the wind was picking up. There weren't many people around, just a couple of kids on the swings at the far end and an old man walking his dog on the trail. We found a picnic table under a big oak tree and set up our makeshift board. "So, how do we do this?" I asked, suddenly feeling nervous. The park felt different somehow, quieter than usual, like everything was holding its breath. "We both need to put our fingers on the planchette," Jake explained. "But you have to let the spirit guide it. Don't force it to move. Just let your fingers rest there lightly." I placed 2 fingers on the edge of the cream cap, and Jake did the same on the opposite side. "Now we need to ask if any spirits want to talk to us," Jake said, looking way too excited. "We both have to ask together." We started repeating, "Is there any spirit who wishes to speak with us?" Over and over. Nothing happened. The cap just sat there, motionless. After about 15 attempts, I was getting bored and uncomfortable. The temperature had dropped, and I was starting to shiver. "This is stupid. Nothing's happening. Let's go back to my house and play Xbox or something," I complained. "One more try," Jake insisted. "If nothing happens, we'll leave." "Fine. Last time." We asked the question again, not really expecting anything, when suddenly the cap started to move. It was slight at first, barely noticeable, but then it slid smoothly toward the word YES. I immediately looked up at Jake, pissed off. "Very funny, dude. Stop pushing it." But Jake's face had gone pale. "I'm not moving it, I swear to God." "Yeah, right. You're the one who wanted to do this so badly." I was getting angry now. "No, seriously, I'm not doing anything." His voice had a tremor I'd never heard before. I stared at him, trying to catch him in the lie, but his expression was dead serious. A cold feeling washed over me, but I decided to test him. "Okay, if this is really a spirit and not Jake being a jerk, tell me what's in the bottom drawer of my desk at home." Jake looked confused. "What? I don't even know what's in there." The planchette started moving again, sliding to different letters. I-P-O. My heart dropped. In the bottom drawer of my desk was an old iPod Touch I'd hidden from my parents after I accidentally cracked the screen. I never told Jake about it, never showed it to him. He had no way of knowing it was there. "What did it spell?" Jake asked, looking genuinely confused. "IPO, I whispered, "like iPod. I have an old iPod hidden in my desk drawer." Jake's eyes widened. "Dude, I didn't know that, I swear." Now I was getting genuinely freaked out. My palms were sweaty despite the cool air, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. "Ask it something else." Jake urged, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you? I stammered. The planchette moved again. Spirit. Are you good or bad? Jake asked. The cap hovered for a moment before slowly moving to spell Neither. We asked more questions. What was it thinking? Blood. Where did it come from? Dark. How long had it been dead? Longtime. Each answer came faster than the previous one, as if the spirit was getting more comfortable communicating with us, or maybe it was getting stronger. The cap was moving more confidently now, sliding from letter to letter without hesitation. What's your name? I asked, my voice cracking. John. Are you peaceful, John? Jake's fingers were trembling on the planchette. The cap slid to no. I swallowed hard. Do you want to hurt us? The planchette moved so slowly this time, like it was savoring the moment. It inched across the board until it rested firmly on YES. I looked up at Jake, and he was staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves overhead and sending a shower of acorns onto our table. The kids who had been playing on the swings were gone now. The park was completely empty except for us. I think we should stop, Jake whispered. I nodded, but before we could move our fingers, the planchette started sliding on its own, spelling Notdone. We need to say goodbye, Jake said urgently. We have to end it properly. We both pushed the planchette toward goodbye at the bottom of the board, but it felt like pushing against a strong magnet. It kept trying to pull back to the center. Come on, I muttered, using more force. Finally, we got it to goodbye. Jake immediately stood up, grabbing the board. We need to get rid of this, now. He ran over to a trash can, but I stopped him. No, not there. It's too close. What if someone else finds it? We looked around desperately and spotted a maintenance area behind the restrooms. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence with a locked gate, but there was a gap underneath where the ground had eroded. Jake shoved the board through the gap and kicked dirt over it. Let's get out of here, he said, already backing away. We ran to our bikes and pedaled faster than we ever had before. The sky had darkened considerably, and the first few raindrops were starting to fall. As we raced down the main road, we passed a man walking a large German shepherd. The dog went absolutely ballistic when we passed, lunging at us and barking like it was possessed. The man could barely hold it back. "What the hell?" Jake shouted as we sped past. "Don't stop," I yelled back. We made it to my house just as the rain started pouring. We rushed inside, soaking wet and breathing hard. My mom asked if we were okay, and we mumbled something about getting caught in the storm. We spent the rest of the evening in my room, barely talking, just sitting there trying to process what had happened. That night, after Jake went home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house, every shadow on the wall seemed sinister. I kept feeling like something was in my room with me, watching from the corner. It wasn't an overwhelming presence, just a slight feeling, like when you think someone's looking at you, but when you turn around, nobody's there. I kept the lights on all night. When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight streaming through my window. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, that we'd somehow convinced ourselves something supernatural had happened when there was probably a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. We had contacted something in that park, something that knew things it shouldn't have known, something that had wanted to hurt us. For the next week, I continued to feel that faint presence, especially at night. It never did anything, never moved objects or appeared visibly, but I could sense it there, watching. Then, after about a week, the feeling disappeared completely. It was like whatever had followed me home had gotten bored and moved on. Jake and I never talked about what happened at the park. We silently agreed to pretend it never occurred. But sometimes I catch him looking over his shoulder or staring into empty corners, and I know he feels it too. The lingering fear that what we experienced was real. It's been 3 years, and I still get chills thinking about that afternoon. I don't know if we were lucky or if John just decided we weren't worth the trouble. But I do know one thing for certain. I will never, ever mess with a Ouija board again. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, especially by stupid teenagers looking for a thrill on a boring Sunday afternoon.